The air of the late Pleistocene did not merely move, it possessed a weight, a density of oxygen and ancient pollen that filled the lungs with the very essence of a primordial world. To stand upon the edge of the Mammoth steppe 12 millennia ago was to stand at the threshold of a forgotten majesty, a time when the earth breathed with a slow, rhythmic pulse that seemed as though it would never falter. Imagine, if you will, the silence of a world before the mechanical roar of progress, a silence so profound that the crackle of a single frost-shattered branch could echo for miles across the permafrost. The sky above was not the pale, hazy blue we know today, but a deep, crystalline indigo, so clear that the stars did not merely twinkle, they burned like steady silver fires in the firmament. In this realm of deep time, the human story was but a slender thread woven into a vast and intricate tapestry of ice, grass, and bone. We were a nomadic whisper, a brief flicker of warmth moving across a landscape dominated by titans, existing in a state of grace that we can now only dimly recall in our dreams. The world was a theater of giants. Across the horizon, the great herds of woolly mammoths moved like slow, living mountains, their massive tusks sweeping through the snow to reach the nutrient-rich grasses beneath. They were the architects of the steppe, their heavy footfalls tamping down the earth, their presence a guarantee of the ecosystem's balance. The scent of them, a heavy, earthy musk mixed with the sharp aroma of crushed juniper and sagebrush, clung to the wind, a biological signature of a world in its golden age. For our ancestors, the mammoth was not merely prey. It was a brother, a sovereign entity whose life and death dictated the survival of the tribe. We followed them with a reverence born of necessity, our movements synchronized with their seasonal migrations, our very heartbeats attuned to the thunderous vibration of their travel. In the eyes of the hunter-gatherer, the world felt eternal, a stable and predictable cycle of freeze and thaw that had persisted for 1,000 generations, back into the mists of a time before memory. But let us look closer at the human figure standing in the shadow of these giants. This was a creature of incredible physical refinement, a masterpiece of evolutionary endurance. Their skin was toughened by the dry, biting winds of the glacial north, their muscles corded and lean, designed for the long-distance pursuit of the herd. To be human in this era was to possess a body that was a finely tuned instrument of survival, a biological vessel carrying the accumulated wisdom of 2 million years of ancestral struggle. We must visualize a family group huddled in the lee of a limestone cliff, the firelight dancing against the walls of a cave that had served as a sanctuary for eons. The fire was more than a source of heat. It was the center of the universe, a sacred hearth, where the day's exhaustion was traded for the safety of the collective. As the smoke curled upward toward the stars, the elders would speak in low, melodic tones, their language a symphony of clicks, vowels, and gestures that captured the essence of the world around them. They told stories of the great bear in the sky, of the first woman who stole fire from the lightning, and of the spirits that resided in the flint and the stream. This was the era of the supreme generalist. Our ancestors did not specialize in one environment. They were masters of the interface, living at the edge of the ice, at the fringe of the forest, and along the banks of rivers that ran clear with glacial melt. Their hands, those exquisite tools of articulation, were already capable of the most delicate tasks, sewing hides with bone needles, napping flint into razor-sharp bifaces, and cradling the heads of their infants with a tenderness that defied the brutality of the climate. The human hand in the Pleistocene was a silent witness to our growing complexity, a character in its own right that had learned to transform the raw materials of nature into the culture of the tribe. Each strike of a hammerstone against a core of obsidian was a dialogue with the earth, a manifestation of a mind that could see the hidden blade within the stone. This cognitive leap, the ability to imagine what did not yet exist, was the true weapon of our species, yet it was exercised with a humility that kept us in balance with the wild. The environment of this golden age was one of Mammoth steppe, a unique biome that has no modern equivalent. It was a vast, treeless grassland that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Europe, across the heart of Eurasia, and over the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas. It was a cold, dry, but incredibly productive landscape. The sun, though distant, fueled the growth of high-protein grasses that supported an abundance of life that would dwarf any modern savanna. There were horses with coats of thick dun fur, giant deer with antlers spanning 12 feet, and the cave lion, a predator of such size and power that its image, etched into the walls of Chauvet and Lascaux, still commands a primal shiver of awe. We moved through this world as shadows of the lion, careful and observant, our senses heightened to a degree that a modern human can scarcely comprehend. The snap of a twig, the shift in the wind's temperature, the specific alarm call of a bird. These were the data points of a life-and-death reality. In this state of profound stability, the concept of progress did not exist as we understand it. Success was not defined by change, but by continuity. If the children grew strong, if the skins were warm, and if the herds returned with the spring, the world was right. There was a sacredness in the repetition. Our ancestors sat around fires that mirrored the constellations above, seeing the same patterns of stars that their great-grandparents had seen. They lived in deep time, a psychological state where the past, present, and future were a single, seamless loop. The stars were the map of their heritage, and the earth was the tomb of their ancestors. There was no sense that the world could ever be different. The ice seemed as permanent as the mountains, and the mammoths seemed as numerous as the blades of grass. This was the Great Quietude, a period of human existence where we were perfectly adapted to our niche, a peak of hunter-gatherer perfection. But consider the hidden cost of this stability. Our biology was forged in the furnace of the Ice Age, adapted for a specific range of temperatures and a specific caloric intake. We were overfitted to the Pleistocene. Our bodies were designed to crave fats and sugars because they were rare, to conserve energy because the hunt was grueling, and to fear the dark because the predators were real. This biological legacy, this ancient memory carved in bone, was a survival weapon in 12,000 BCE, but it was also a latent vulnerability. In the silence of the genome, the code was waiting. A subtle shift in the Earth's orbit, a slight wobble in its axis, or perhaps something more sudden and violent from the void above was preparing to test that resilience to its absolute breaking point. As we narrate this biography of the body, we must look at the foot, the arched bipedal masterpiece that allowed us to roam these thousands of miles. The human foot in the Stone Age was not encased in leather or rubber. It was a sensory organ in its own right, calloused and sensitive, capable of feeling the vibration of a distant herd through the soles. Our ancestors walked with a soft, rolling gait, their toes spreading to grip the uneven terrain of the tundra. Each step was a communion with the earth, a physical declaration of our belonging to the landscape. To walk was to survive. to run was to thrive. We were the persistence hunters, the creatures who could out-endure the swiftest gazelle by simply never stopping, our sweat-gland-rich skin allowing us to shed heat that would collapse a fur-covered animal. This was our evolutionary edge, not strength, not speed, but the terrifying, patient power of endurance. Life in the Golden Age was a symphony of sensory details. Picture a woman of the tribe gathering berries in the late afternoon light of a dying autumn. The air is crisp, smelling of incoming snow and the dry, sweet scent of cured grass. She wears a parka of reindeer hide, stitched with such precision that it is entirely windproof. Her eyes, darkened by protective pigments against the snow glare, are constantly scanning the horizon. She notices a group of ravens circling a distant ridge, a sign of a kill, perhaps left by a pride of lions. She communicates this to her kin with a sharp whistle, a sound that blends perfectly into the natural soundscape. There is no anxiety in her movements, only a focused, meditative presence. She is a part of the emerald wilderness, as much a feature of the land as the lichen on the rocks. She does not know that within her lifetime, or the lifetime of her children, the ravens will have more to feast upon than they ever imagined. The Golden Age was also a time of spiritual expansion. We were the first creatures on this planet to bury our dead with flowers, with beads of ivory, and with the red ochre of the earth. In these burials, we see the first evidence of a soul that could not accept the finality of death. We were beginning to ask, why? Why did the sun disappear? Why did the herds move? Why did the stars stay silent? This emerging consciousness was a double-edged sword. It gave us the ability to plan and cooperate, but it also introduced the first shadows of existential dread. We looked at the mammoth and saw a god. We looked at the sky and saw a story. In the quietude of the Stone Age, the human spirit was complete, anchored by a deep connection to the natural world that provided everything we needed. We were wealthy in time, rich in community, and secure in our understanding of the world's rules. But the clock of the cosmos is indifferent to human grace. Even as our ancestors sang their songs and honed their spears, the physical world was beginning to tremble. The glaciers, those miles-thick sheets of ice that had defined the geography of the northern hemisphere for eons, were reaching a state of unstable equilibrium. The weight of them had depressed the very crust of the earth, and the atmosphere was becoming a tinderbox of shifting currents. In the silence of the deep oceans, the conveyor belts of heat were beginning to falter. The great silence was not just a lack of sound. It was the breath the world takes before a scream. We must imagine the last few years of this stability. The harvests of roots and tubers were perhaps slightly less abundant. The winters were perhaps a week longer. Small changes easily dismissed by a people who measured time in generations. The mammoths still moved, the fires still burned, and the stars still mirrored the hearths of the people. But the silent witness of our biology was sensing a shift. The birds were migrating earlier. The insects were different. A subtle error was creeping into the code of the seasons. We were masters of a world that was already beginning to dissolve at the edges, witnesses to a sunset we mistook for a permanent dawn. This was the world before the veil was torn, a landscape of emerald and indigo, of ivory and fire. It was a time of absolute belonging, where the human animal was not an outsider looking in, but a vital, functioning component of a planetary machine. We were the witnesses to the Pleistocene's final, magnificent flourish. We sat in the tall grass, our hands resting on the handles of our flint knives, watching the slow, living rivers of the Mammoth move across the horizon, unaware that the heavens were preparing a reset that would erase the world we knew and forge us into something entirely new. The transformation would be blinding, it would be absolute, and it would leave us forever longing for the silence of the 12,000 years that came before. To understand the arrival of the visitor, we must first retreat into the microscopic libraries of our own blood. Deep within the architecture of the human cell, inside the coiled silence of the genome, there exists a biological record of everything that has ever tried to kill us. It is a history book written not in ink, but in the base pairs of DNA, a catalog of ancient viruses, freezing epochs, and moments of starvation that our ancestors survived by the narrowest of margins. But there is no gene for the sky falling. There is no protein folded within the helix that prepares a mammal for the moment when the celestial ceiling of the world begins to crumble. And yet, in the weeks leading up to the event, a dormant awareness began to stir. A collective, unspoken intuition that rippled through the biosphere, whispering that the heavens were no longer static. This was not a conscious thought, but a vibration in the marrow, a subtle dissonance in the symphony of the wild that suggested the predictable rhythm of the Pleistocene was about to be broken by a chaotic intruder. High above the atmosphere, far beyond the reach of the highest clouds or the flight of the strongest eagle, a traveler was approaching. It had been born in the freezing darkness of the Oort cloud, that vast spherical shell of icy debris that surrounds our solar system like a forgotten graveyard of planetary formation. For billions of years, this traveler had drifted in a coma of absolute zero, a silent, frozen mountain of rock, ammonia, ice, and dust, holding within its heart the chemical fingerprint of the universe's dawn. It was a fragment of the chaotic architecture that built us, a stray bullet left over from the violent birth of the sun, hurtling through the void with a blind mathematical purpose. It had no name, no intent, and no malice. It was simply physics in motion, a kinetic equation waiting to be solved by the surface of the Earth. As it crossed the threshold of the inner solar system, the heat of the sun began to wake the sleeping giant. The ice, frozen for eons, began to sublimate, turning directly from solid to gas, creating a magnificent glowing coma that expanded for thousands of miles around the nucleus. To the eyes of the creatures below, the grazing herds of the steppe, the prowling saber-toothed cats, and the clans of humans wrapped in furs, it appeared first as a wandering star. It was an anomaly in the fixed map of the night, a point of light that refused to adhere to the rigid dance of the constellations. Night after night it grew brighter, swelling from a pinprick of white fire into a smudge of pale luminescence that rivaled the brilliance of the Milky Way. It became a second moon, a ghostly, unblinking eye that cast a strange silver light over the tundra, washing out the familiar shadows and painting the world in a hue of spectral blue. Imagine the visual transformation of the prehistoric landscape. The nights of the Pleistocene were typically realms of profound darkness, illuminated only by the soft waxing and waning cycle of the moon and the distinct crisp blanket of stars. But this new light was different. It was constant, harsh, and pervasive. It seeped into the entrances of caves, disturbing the sleep of those who sought refuge within. It reflected off the vast glaciers of the Laurentide ice sheet, turning the walls of ice into glowing ramparts that seemed to pulse with an inner energy. The snow, usually a canvas of soft grays and blacks at night, now shimmered with an eerie incandescence, revealing the tracks of predator and prey with a clarity that felt unnatural. The circadian rhythms of the planet, honed over millions of years of evolution to the binary pulse of day and night, began to fracture. The visitor had turned the night into a twilight of perpetual anxiety, a time when the darkness offered no cover and the light offered no warmth. The animals, those supreme masters of sensory reception, were the first to understand that the order of the world was unraveling. The woolly mammoth, a creature of immense emotional and social complexity, felt the disturbance in the very soles of its feet. Mammoths possessed a sensitivity to infrasound, low-frequency vibrations that travel through the earth, allowing them to communicate over vast distances and detect approaching storms. But now, the earth itself seemed to hum with a strange, unrecognizable frequency. The herds stopped their grazing. The matriarchs, usually the pillars of stoic wisdom, turned their great curved tusks toward the northern horizon, their trunks testing the air for a scent that did not belong to the pollen or the pine. They huddled closer together, forming defensive circles not against wolves or lions, but against the sky itself. The calves, sensing the tension in their mothers' bodies, pressed against the thick, shaggy flanks of the adults, seeking comfort in a world that had suddenly grown hostile. The birds, too, fell into a profound and unsettling silence. The great flocks of waterfowl that usually heralded the changing seasons with their cacophony became mute. The ravens, the owls, and the snow geese, creatures that navigated by the magnetic lines of the earth and the map of the stars, found themselves adrift in a sensory distortion. The intruder in the sky was not just a source of light, it was a disruptor of the planet's magnetic soul. As the comet drew closer, its interaction with the solar wind created geomagnetic storms that rippled through the upper atmosphere, confusing the internal compasses of the avian world. The forests and the steppes, usually alive with the rustle of wings and the call of the wild, fell into a heavy, expectant quietude. It was a silence that pressed against the eardrums, a vacuum of sound that amplified the beating of one's own heart. And then, there were the Watchers, our ancestors. The humans of the late Pleistocene were not primitive brutes, but sophisticated observers of the cosmos. Their survival depended on their ability to read the signs of the natural world, the migration of the caribou, the blooming of the tundra flowers, the position of the Pleiades. They had built a culture around the reliability of the sky. The stars were their calendar, their clock, and their mythology. But this new object defied all the stories that had been passed down by the elders. It was a character that had no role in the play, a stranger that had walked onto the stage and refused to leave. Picture a clan gathered at the mouth of a limestone shelter, looking out over a valley bathed in that strange, milky radiance. The fire at their feet, usually a source of comfort and security, seemed dim and insignificant against the glare from above. The elders, men and women whose faces were maps of wrinkles earned through decades of survival, pointed their gnarled fingers at the intruder, their voices low and urgent. They spoke of omens, of angry spirits, of a celestial imbalance that required payment. But beneath the ritual and the superstition, there was a raw, primal fear, the biological terror of the prey animal realizing there is nowhere to hide. The human eye, an organ evolved to detect movement in the grass and the glint of a predator's gaze, was now fixed on an object of sublime terror. The pupils dilated, drinking in the light of the comet, trying to process a visual input that the brain had no reference for. The biography of the eye in this moment is a story of confusion. The retina struggled to categorize the wavelength, the brain struggled to predict the trajectory, and the soul struggled to comprehend the scale. We must consider the evolutionary duality of this moment. For thousands of years, the human trait of pattern recognition had been our greatest survival weapon. It allowed us to see the tiger in the camouflage, to predict the coming winter, to find water in the desert. We were the species that categorized the chaos. But now, that same adaptation became a source of profound vulnerability. The comet broke the pattern. It was a variable that could not be accounted for, a threat that could not be speared, trapped, or outrun. The anxiety that surged through the bodies of our ancestors, the cortisol flooding the blood, the adrenaline sharpening the senses, was a physiological firing of engines for a race that could not be run. We were prepared for the lion, but we were defenseless against the cosmos. As the object grew larger, the very atmosphere began to change. The air grew thick with static electricity. Fur stood on end, hair floated around the faces of the watchers as if suspended in water. The smell of ozone, usually reserved for the aftermath of a lightning strike, became a permanent scent on the wind. It was the smell of the ionosphere bleeding down to the earth, a metallic, sharp tang that coated the back of the throat. The temperature, too, seemed to fluctuate wildly. The visitor was pushing a bow wave of pressure and debris before it, a subtle compression of the air that made the ears pop and the head ache. Let us step into the shoes, or the wrapped leather moccasins, of a young hunter standing on a ridge during these final nights. He is a man of 20 winters, in the prime of his physical life. His body is a testament to the efficacy of the Stone Age diet and the rigors of the nomadic life, lean, strong, and capable. He holds a spear tipped with Clovis flint, a piece of technology that represents the pinnacle of human engineering at the time. The stone is translucent, chipped with agonizing precision to create an edge sharper than a modern surgeon's scalpel. He has spent his life learning the habits of the bison and the mammoth. He knows how to read the bend of the grass and the scuff of a hoof. But as he stands there, bathed in the pale, sickly light of the comet, he feels a profound impotence. His spear, which can pierce the hide of a mastodon, is useless against the sky. The cold wind bites at his exposed face, but it is not the wind that makes him shiver. It is the deep genetic realization that his strength, his skill, and his technology are irrelevant in the face of what is coming. He is witnessing the end of his world, though he does not yet have the language to articulate it. He feels the fragility of the spark, the sudden crushing understanding that his existence and the existence of his people is held together by a thread that is about to snap. The long summer of the late Pleistocene, a period of relative warmth that had allowed human populations to expand and culture to flourish, was about to be extinguished. The ecosystems that had supported the megafauna were standing on a precipice. The grasses, dependent on a specific balance of carbon dioxide and temperature, were about to die. The water cycles, driven by the steady evaporation of the oceans, were about to be frozen in their tracks. The visitor was not just a rock. It was a key that would unlock a cage of climatic chaos. In the final hours before the impact, the silence of the world deepened into something almost solid. The wind died down. The streams seemed to flow with less vigor. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath, bracing for the blow. The comet was now so bright it could be seen in the daylight, a second sun rivaling the first, dragging a tail of dust that spanned half the sky. It was beautiful, in a terrible, awe-inspiring way. It was the universe displaying its power, a reminder that we live on a small boat in a violent ocean. Our ancestors watched from the mouths of caves, their hearts echoing the erratic pulse of the world. They huddled together, skin to skin, seeking the comfort of touch in the face of the infinite. They fed the fires, piling on the precious wood, trying to push back the encroaching strangeness with the familiar light of the hearth. They did not know that the wood they burned, the trees that stood in the valleys, and the animals that hid in the shadows were all about to become fuel for a global conflagration. They did not know that the air they breathed was about to turn to fire and then to ash. They simply watched, witnesses to the final moments of an epoch, unsuspecting guardians of a legacy that would soon be tested by the ultimate trial of survival. The visitor had arrived, and the door to the next chapter of human history was about to be kicked open by a force that would shake the pillars of the earth. The universe, in its vast and indifferent mechanism, operates on scales of time that the human mind can scarcely encompass. We measure our lives in heartbeats, in the rising and setting of the sun, in the slow graying progression of our hair. But the cosmos measures time in collisions. For millions of years, the Earth had spun in a quiet, nurturing cradle of stability, a long, deep breath of geological calm that allowed the mammoth to grow tall and the human mind to sharpen. But that silence was not a promise. It was merely a pause. As the comet fragments, those ragged, frozen travelers from the dawn of the solar system, pierced the upper atmosphere, the pause ended. The timeline of our species, which had been flowing like a lazy river, was about to drop over a precipice. The moment of arrival was not marked by sound. Sound is a terrestrial traveler, a sluggish vibration that must push its way through heavy air. Light, however, is a messenger of the void. It arrives instantly. And so, the first sensation of the end of the world was a blinding, searing illumination that shattered the sanctity of the night. Imagine standing on the high plains of North America, wrapped in the furs of a wolf, your eyes adjusted to the velvet darkness of the Pleistocene. In a fraction of a heartbeat, the sky did not simply brighten, it ignited. It was a light without mercy. It was not the warm, golden embrace of the sun, nor the soft, silver kiss of the moon. It was a harsh, sterile, magnesium-white glare that stripped the world of its depth. For a terrifying second, there were no shadows. The light came from everywhere and nowhere, scattering through the ice crystals of the atmosphere with such intensity that the air itself seemed to glow. To the human eye, that delicate sphere of jelly and nerve evolved to spot ripe fruit in a canopy or the movement of a gazelle in twilight. This light was an assault. The pupil, the body's aperture, slammed shut in a desperate attempt to protect the retina, but the brilliance punched through the eyelids, turning vision into a wash of red and white pain. In that singular, silent flash, the nocturnal world was exposed with the clarity of a vivisection. Every blade of grass, every pebble in the riverbed, every hair on the back of the sleeping bison was revealed in absolute high-contrast detail. It was a shadowless noon that lasted only seconds, but burned itself into the genetic memory of our species as the moment the heavens betrayed us. The fragments, traveling at tens of thousands of miles per hour, slammed into the Laurentide ice sheet. We must pause to consider this target. The Laurentide was not merely a patch of snow, it was a continent of ice. A frozen titan 2 miles thick that smothered the top half of North America. It was a relic of the deep past. A heavy white blanket that had shaped the weather of the world for 100,000 years. When the bolides struck, they did not just break the ice, they annihilated it. The kinetic energy of the impact, the stolen fire of the stars, was converted instantly into heat, thermal energy on a scale that defies terrestrial comparison. The ice did not melt. There was no time for the slow transition to water. It vaporized. In the blink of an eye, cubic miles of ancient compacted glacier, ice that held the bubbles of air from breaths taken before humanity existed, were transformed into superheated steam. A pillar of white fire and water vapor rose into the stratosphere, punching a hole through the atmosphere and reaching toward the vacuum of space. This was the Great Reset, a violent punctuation mark that severed the sentence of the Paleolithic. The geology of the North, which had been locked in a frozen stasis, was liquefied. The bedrock beneath the ice, shielded for eons, was suddenly exposed to the fury of a star brought down to Earth. Then came the heat. Before the air could carry the roar of the impact, it carried the energy. A thermal pulse, a wall of invisible fire, raced outward from the epicenter at the speed of a jet airliner. It swept across the continent, disregarding hills and valleys, moving like a phantom wind. For the flora of the Pleistocene, this was an execution. The great spruce forests, the stands of pine and fir that bordered the glaciers, did not burn in the traditional sense. They flashed. The moisture inside their needles and bark turned to steam instantly, exploding the trees from the inside out. One moment, a forest stood in the silent blue light. The next, it was a landscape of torches, millions of trees, igniting simultaneously in a wave of destruction that raced toward the horizon. Consider the biography of the skin in this moment. Our ancestors, huddled in their camps hundreds of miles away, would have felt this before they heard it. The air temperature spiked. The wind, which had been blowing cold from the north, suddenly reversed and became a blast furnace. The hairs on the arms singed. The moisture on the lips evaporated. It was a physical sensation of the world turning inside out, the cold comfort of the Ice Age replaced by a suffocating dry heat that smelled of ozone and singing hair. The skin, our body's first line of defense, registered a threat it could not comprehend. A sunburn in the middle of the night, a fever that came from the sky. And finally, the sound arrived. The atmosphere, compressed by the impact and the expanding cloud of vapor, recoiled. A shock wave, a solid wall of air, hammered across the land. It was a sound so loud it ceased to be a noise and became a pressure. It was the roar of the apocalypse, a frequency that rattled the teeth in the skull and vibrated the marrow in the bones. It shattered the eardrums of the mammoth and the mouse alike. It snapped trees that had survived the heat, flattened the huts of the hunter-gatherers, and tossed the great beasts of the steppe like toys. The silence of 12,000 years ago was not broken, it was murdered. The great silence that we speak of in the aftermath was not a peaceful quiet, but the ringing emptiness of a world that had been deafened. As the shock wave passed, the atmosphere began to bruise. The impact had thrown billions of tons of debris into the upper air. Pulverized rock, microscopic diamonds formed by the pressure, soot from the burning forests, and the vapor of the murdered glaciers. The sky, which had been that deep, unpolluted indigo, began to curdle. It turned a sickly, bruised violet, then a choked gray, and finally, a terrifying, impenetrable black. The sun, when it rose the next morning, was a stranger. It was a dim red eye peering through a curtain of ash, offering no warmth, only a dull, bloody light that failed to cast a shadow. The biography of the lungs began its struggle here. The air was no longer sweet with juniper and ice. It was acrid, filled with the taste of pulverized granite and the oily soot of a continent on fire. Every breath was a labor, a gritty intake of a world that was dying. Our ancestors pulled their furs over their faces, breathing through the skins of the animals they had hunted, trying to filter the death from the air. But the fire was only half of the devastation. The ice sheet, wounded and weeping, began to bleed. The vaporization had been instant, but the melting that followed was catastrophic. The structural integrity of the glaciers collapsed. Massive lakes of meltwater, trapped behind walls of ice for millennia, were suddenly unleashed. This was the birth of the feverish boiling tide. Torrents of fresh water, gray with glacial flour and churning with icebergs the size of cathedrals, roared toward the oceans. Imagine the scablands of North America being carved in a matter of days. The water moved with such violence that it stripped the soil down to the bedrock, tearing away the skin of the earth to reveal the bone beneath. It carried boulders the size of houses, tumbling them in the current like pebbles. The noise of this rushing water would have been a constant grinding thunder, a bass note of destruction that underscored the high-pitched shrieking of the winds. For the people living on the coasts, and we must remember the coastlines of the Pleistocene were miles further out than they are today, this was the end of their world. The sea level did not rise by inches over decades. It rose in surges, in great heaving pulses of water that swallowed the land. Doggerland, that rich and fertile paradise that connected Britain to Europe, began its final drowning. The hunters who walked those lowlands, who fished in the slow-winding rivers of what is now the bottom of the North Sea, found the water rising around their ankles, then their knees. They retreated to higher ground, but the water followed, a relentless rising tide that consumed the camps, the burial grounds, and the forests. The geography of human memory was literally being erased. The landmarks, the great oak tree where the council met, the stone ridge where the flint was gathered, vanished beneath the gray, churning waves. The ocean circulation, the heartbeat of the global climate, went into cardiac arrest. The influx of cold, fresh water into the North Atlantic shut down the Gulf Stream. The heat that had been transported from the tropics to the north was cut off. The world, still burning from the fires of the impact, began to freeze. It was a paradox of destruction, fire in the sky, ice in the water. The Younger Dryas had begun, a 1,000-year winter born from a moment of heat. In the midst of this chaos, the biological world was thrown into a state of absolute confusion. The biography of the herd is a tragic chapter here. The woolly mammoths, creatures of habit and memory, found their mental maps useless. The paths they had followed for generations were blocked by walls of fire or erased by floods. The grasses they ate were buried under ash or withered by the sudden toxicity of the air. We can imagine the distress calls of the matriarchs, trumpeting into the dark, ash-filled sky, receiving no answer but the howling of the wind. The bond between the mother and the calf, the strongest emotional tether in the animal kingdom, was tested by the chaos. Calves were lost in the gloom, separated by the panic of the stampede. The great beasts, the silent witnesses of the epoch, began to stumble. Their lungs, built for the clean, cold air of the steppe, clogged with particulate matter. Their great hearts, stressed by fear and starvation, began to fail. And what of us? What of the human animal in this landscape of ruin? We were the witnesses who had become the victims. The duality of our evolution was laid bare. We were physically vulnerable, soft-skinned, slow, without claws or fur to protect us from the elements. But we possessed a mind that could adapt. Yet, even the human mind has its limits. The trauma of this event imprinted itself onto the collective psyche of the species. This was the moment the fear of the sky was born. Before this, the heavens were a clock, a map, a god. After this, the heavens were a threat. The stories told around the dying fires changed. They were no longer tales of the hunt or the ancestors. They were warnings. They were the seeds of the myths we still tell today, of the great flood that washed away the sin of the world, of the fire that fell from the sun, of the darkness that lasted for 3 days. The day in the life of a survivor in the weeks following the impact was a grim exercise in endurance. Picture a woman, her face smeared with a mixture of grease and ash to protect her skin, digging through the snow and soot to find roots. The snow is not white. It is gray, stained by the fallout. The sun is a pale disk that offers no heat. She is hungry, a deep, gnawing hollowness that has become her constant companion. The herds are gone, vanished into the gray mist. She carries a child in a sling of fur, the infant silent, conserving its energy. She moves with a slow, deliberate economy, every step calculated to save a calorie. She stops to examine a track in the ash, a hare perhaps, or a fox. It is a sign of life in a necropolis. She sets a snare, her fingers stiff with cold, working the sinew with a muscle memory that bypasses her conscious thought. She does not look up at the sky. She looks only at the ground, at the task at hand. The sky is the enemy. The earth is the only thing left that can save her. We must also consider the silent errors in the code of life that were occurring in the unseen world. The radiation from the impact, the stress of the starvation, the exposure to the chemical changes in the atmosphere, these were mutagenic forces. The DNA of the survivors was being subjected to a brutal selection pressure. Those who could store fat more efficiently, those who could metabolize scarce nutrients, those whose immune systems could handle the sudden influx of pathogens from the rotting carcasses of the megafauna, these were the ones who lived to pass on their genes. We are the descendants of these genetic lottery winners. The Thrifty gene that plagues modern humanity with obesity and diabetes is a hero of this story, a biological adaptation that saved our ancestors from the starvation of the Younger Dryas. It is a survival weapon forged in the ash of the fallen sky, a lingering memory of the time when the world went hungry. The landscape itself was transformed into a chaotic, swirling vortex. The recognizable biomes, the steppe, the forest, the tundra, were blended into a muddy, gray homogeneity. The emerald wilderness was gone, replaced by a black mat of decay. This layer, which we can still find today in the geological record, is a tombstone. It contains the nanodiamonds, the iridium, and the soot that prove the story is true. It marks the boundary between the world of the giants and the world of the survivors. Above this black line, the mammoth is gone. The Clovis point, that beautiful fluted stone blade, disappears. The culture that made it could not sustain itself in the new world. The technology of the spear had to be replaced by the technology of the seed. The Great Reset was not just a physical event. It was a psychological pivot point. In the darkness of the post-impact world, humanity was forced to look inward. The easy abundance of the Golden Age was over. The delicate symmetry with nature was broken. We could no longer trust the world to provide. We had to force it. The seeds of agriculture, of settlement, of hierarchy were sown in this trauma. If the wild world could be destroyed in an instant, then we had to create our own stability. We had to build walls, granaries, and temples. We had to appease the angry sky and tame the broken earth. As the fires burned out and the floods receded, a silence returned to the world. But it was not the heavy prehistoric rhythm of the mammoth steppe. It was a fragile, tentative silence. The birds that sang were different species. The trees that grew back were different forests. The humans who emerged from the caves were different people. They carried the memory of the fire in their songs and the memory of the hunger in their blood. The sky that fell had rewritten the script of life on Earth. The titans were dead. The age of the mammal was ending. The age of the mind was beginning. And deep within the marrow of the survivors, the lesson was carved. Nothing is permanent. The world is a gift that can be revoked. The sun is a star that can hide. And we are but small, warm things huddled in the dark, waiting for the light to return, hoping that the next time the sky brightens, it is the dawn and not the end. The fire was a fury, a momentary scream of the earth releasing its agony, but the ash was a shroud. Following the blinding violence of the impact, a heaviness settled over the world, a silence so profound it felt as though the very physics of sound had been dampened by the weight of the air. We must imagine the transition not as a sudden switch, but as a slow, suffocating curtain being drawn across the stage of the Pleistocene. The roaring winds that had scoured the continents in the wake of the heat pulse began to die down, losing their energy to the deepening cold, leaving behind an atmosphere that was no longer transparent, but opaque. The sky, which for millions of years had been a window to the infinite, became a ceiling of charcoal. The blue jewel of Earth was wrapped in a bandage of pulverized rock, soot, and sulfur. A stratospheric veil that turned the day into a perpetual, bruised twilight. This was the onset of the Great Silence, a period where the planet seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a dawn that refused to break. For the survivors, the first realization of this new reality was visual. The sun, that great golden deity that had dictated the rhythm of life since the first cell divided in the primordial soup, was reduced to a ghost. It did not rise, it merely appeared as a faint, sickly luminescence in the east, a dim copper coin struggling to pierce through the thick shroud of stratospheric soot. It offered no heat, only a spectral reddish light that washed the color from the world. The vibrant greens of the spruce forests, the golden hues of the steppe grass, the blue of the glacial meltwater, all were rendered into shades of gray and black. To look up was to see a bruise where the sky used to be. The human eye evolved over eons to detect the rich, multi-spectral signals of a vibrant ecosystem was suddenly adrift in a monochrome nightmare. The pupils dilated, straining to pull in photons that were no longer there, leaving our ancestors in a state of permanent physiological dusk. The biography of the eye tells us a story of confusion during these years. The circadian rhythms, those internal clocks wound by the rising and setting of the sun, began to drift. Without the strong blue light of morning to reset the brain's chemistry, sleep became fragmented. The survivors moved through a dreamlike state, a lethargy born of melatonin that never quite dissolved. The boundary between waking and sleeping blurred, mirroring the blurred horizon where the gray earth met the gray sky. In this twilight, the shadow of depression, a chemical response to the lack of light, began to weigh as heavily on the human spirit as the ash weighed on the leaves. We became creatures of the gloom, moving slowly, conserving energy, our eyes constantly scanning the dim middle distance for threats that could emerge from the fog without warning. And then the cold returned. But this was not the clean, crisp cold of the Ice Age that our ancestors had mastered. That had been a dry, stable cold, a predictable season that could be managed with fire and fur. This was a damp, rotting cold, a wet chill that seeped into the very stones of the earth. The impact had thrown so much moisture and particulate matter into the upper atmosphere that it blocked the solar radiation, reflecting the sun's energy back into space. The Earth's energy budget collapsed. The Younger Dryas had begun, a climate anomaly so severe it plunged the planet back into glacial conditions within a matter of months. It was a 1,000-year chill, a sudden brutal winter that arrived in the middle of a warming world, catching every living thing off guard. Imagine the shock to the skin. The human integument is a sensitive organ, capable of detecting a single degree of temperature shift. For generations, the people had felt the world warming. They had shed the heaviest of their furs. They had moved into the open valleys. Now, the wind carried a knife edge of frost that bit through the layers of hide. It was a cold that smelled of sulfur and wet ash, a chemical cold that irritated the mucous membranes and cracked the lips. The biography of the skin records this era as a time of constant assault. The extremities, the fingers that napped the flint, the toes that gripped the earth, were constantly numb. The blood shunted to the core to keep the vital organs alive. We became a huddled species, our physical boundaries contracting to the radius of the firelight. The ecological collapse was swift and silent. The plants, the foundation of the entire food web, were the first to despair. Photosynthesis is a transaction of light. Without the currency of the sun, the transaction failed. The great wilting began. Across the northern hemisphere, the forests that had been recovering from the Ice Age stopped growing. The sap froze in the veins of the trees. The leaves, coated in a layer of sticky gray soot, could not breathe. They turned black and fell, not with the crunch of autumn, but with the wet slap of decay. The emerald wilderness that had sustained the mammoth herds transformed into a skeletal wasteland. The trees stood like monuments to a dead era, their branches bare, stripped of needles, whistling a hollow, mournful tune in the wind. This silence of the flora created a silence of the fauna. The vibrant chorus of the plains, the buzzing of insects, the song of the meadowlarks, the chittering of ground squirrels vanished. The insects, dependent on the warmth to fly and the nectar to feed, died in the billions. Their absence severed the food chain at its base. The birds, finding no food and no stars to navigate by, fell from the sky or huddled in the lee of the dying trees, their feathers fluffed against a cold they could not escape. To walk through a forest in the first year of the blackened sun was to walk through a cathedral of the dead. There was no movement, no rustle of underbrush, no flash of wing. Only the sound of the wind, rubbing the dead branches together like dry bones. For the megafauna, the titans of the Pleistocene, this was the end of the road. The mammoth, the mastodon, the giant ground sloth, these were creatures built for volume. They required hundreds of pounds of vegetation every day to fuel their massive bodies. When the grass withered and the willow shrubs died, their metabolism became their enemy. We must look at the biography of the stomach of a mammoth during this time. The great fermentation vats of their gut, designed to extract energy from the toughest steppe grass, sat empty. The hunger was a slow, grinding torture. The herds, confused by the darkness and the sudden glaciation, clustered together in the valleys, stripping the bark from the dead trees in a desperate attempt to find nutrients. We can visualize a scene of heartbreaking tragedy. A matriarch, Mammoth, her coat thick and matted with ash, standing over a calf that has collapsed in the snow. The snow is not white, it is gray, stained by the fallout. She nudges the calf with her trunk, a limb of exquisite sensitivity, trying to rouse it. But the calf is cold. The milk has dried up. The matriarch herself is starving, her reserves of fat depleted by the cold and the lack of food. She stands there for days, a silent sentinel in the gloom, until the cold claims her as well. Their bones would eventually be covered by a layer of sediment known to geologists as the black mat, a dark, carbon-rich layer that marks the boundary of their extinction. It is a mass grave, a geological scar that separates the world of the giants from the world of the small and the desperate. For humanity, this was the crucible. We were not exempt from the laws of thermodynamics or biology. We were the wandering witnesses, moving through a twilight world that had turned against us. The easy calories of the golden age were gone. The herds were dying, and the ones that remained were skittish, lean, and desperate. The biography of the lungs became a central struggle. The air was filled with fine particulate matter, sharp, microscopic shards of rock and soot that bypassed the body's natural filters. Our ancestors developed a persistent hacking cough. Their lungs, once pink and healthy from the clean air of the steppe, became coated with the dust of the apocalypse. Every breath was a struggle against the dust, a gritty reminder that the sky had fallen. Consider the day in the life of a survivor in the depths of the Younger Dryas. A man wakes in a shelter constructed of mammoth bones and sod, buried half underground to escape the wind. It is difficult to tell if it is morning or night. The light outside is a constant dim gray. He uncurls from a pile of furs, his joints stiff with the pervasive cold. His breath plumes before him, instantly freezing into crystals on his beard. The fire, the heart of the home, has burned down to embers. He feeds it with a piece of precious dry wood, perhaps a branch from a tree that died years ago. The wood is scarce now. The forests are not regrowing. He crawls out of the shelter into the biting wind. The landscape is alien. The snowdrifts are covered in a crust of black dust. He checks his snares, his movements slow and deliberate. He is in a state of chronic ketosis, his body burning its own fat reserves to survive. He finds a hare, frozen and stiff in the snare. It is small, lean, with hardly any meat on its bones, but it is life. He looks at the horizon, searching for the sun, but sees only the copper glow behind the clouds. He feels a deep ancestral loneliness. The old ones, the elders who knew the secrets of the herbs and the stars, did not survive the first winter. The library of oral history has been burned. He is young, yet he feels ancient. He carries the weight of survival for his entire lineage. If he fails, the line ends. This period of starvation and cold forced a silent error in the code of life to become a savior. In a land of plenty, a metabolism that burns energy quickly is a luxury. In the land of the blackened sun, it was a death sentence. The survivors were those whose bodies clung to every calorie, whose insulin levels spiked to store even the smallest amount of sugar as fat. This Thrifty gene, a mutation that allowed our ancestors to survive the 1,000-year winter, is a biological legacy we still carry today. It is the reason we gain weight so easily in our modern world of abundance. Our bodies are still preparing for the Younger Dryas. Our cells still remember the hunger of the blackened sun. We are the descendants of the most efficient hoarders of energy, the children of the ones who could endure the long fast. The social fabric of humanity was also tested and rewoven in this twilight. The large, loose aggregations of the Golden Age, where clans would meet to trade and celebrate, broke down. The landscape could no longer support large groups. We splintered into small, tight-knit family units, roving bands of 10 or 12, moving constantly to find pockets of life. The fear of the stranger was born here. A stranger was another mouth to feed, a threat to the dwindling resources. Trust contracted. The circle of empathy shrank to the immediate kin. The stories told around the fire changed tone. They were no longer epic tales of wandering. They were cautionary tales of preparedness. They spoke of the angry sky, of the need to appease the spirits, of the fragility of the world. The trauma of the event was etched into the culture, creating a psychological scar that would manifest in myths of the apocalypse for millennia to come. We must also acknowledge the evolutionary duality of the human mind during this crisis. The same brain that felt the crushing weight of depression and fear was also the engine of innovation. The pressure of the cold forced us to become better architects. We learned to sew tighter clothing, using bone needles so fine they are miracles of engineering. We learned to build better shelters, using the thermal mass of the earth to trap heat. We experimented with new food sources, digging deeper for tubers, cracking open bones to extract the grease, pounding wild grains into flour to make them digestible. The technology of desperation accelerated our development. We stopped being passive collectors of nature's bounty and started becoming manipulators of the environment. The seeds of the Neolithic revolution, the shift to agriculture, were likely planted in the psychological soil of this era. We learned that we could not rely on the world to provide. We had to force it to yield. As the years stretched into decades, and the decades into centuries, the blackened sun became the only reality the new generations knew. They had never seen a clear blue sky. They had never felt the warmth of a true summer. To them, the stories of the Golden Age were fairy tales, myths of a paradise that perhaps never existed. They were children of the ash, born into a world of gray snow and skeletal trees. Yet, they played. They laughed. They loved. The human spark is fragile, yes, but it is also stubbornly, irrationally persistent. Even in the shadow of the apocalypse, the mother still cradled the child, the artist still carved the figure of the deer into the handle of the knife, and the storyteller still tried to make sense of the dark. The blackened sun was a bottleneck, a narrow passage through which the entirety of our species had to pass. It squeezed us, stripped us of our numbers, and tested every facet of our biology and our spirit. It filtered out the weak, the unadaptable, the unlucky. It left behind a hardened, scarred, and deeply resilient population. We carry the memory of that darkness in our bones, in our genes, and in our nightmares. When we look up at a storm cloud and feel a primal shiver, it is not just the rain we fear. It is the echo of a time when the clouds did not break, when the sun turned its face away, and we were left alone to wander the frozen, silent ruins of the world we once knew. To walk into the world that followed the Great Reset is to walk into a cathedral where the music has suddenly stopped. The air, once thick with the musk of a million beasts, and the heavy rhythmic vibration of their footfalls had grown thin and brittle. A silence, absolute and terrifying, began to settle over the northern hemisphere, a silence that was not peace, but an absence. It was the acoustic void left behind when the architects of the earth ceased their labor. We must close our eyes and listen to this silence. It is the sound of the wind whistling through the ribs of a landscape that has lost its soul. The woolly mammoth, that titan of the Pleistocene, the gentle giant that had walked alongside our ancestors for so long that its silhouette was burned into our genetic memory, was beginning to fade. This was not a sudden disappearance, like a candle blown out in a draft, but a slow, agonizing unraveling of a biological tapestry that had taken eons to weave. The ghost of the mammoth was not merely a spirit, it was a physical reality of the ecosystem collapsing in real time. To understand the gravity of this loss, we must first understand the creature itself. The mammoth was not simply an animal, it was a landscape engineer. For hundreds of thousands of years, these behemoths had acted as the gardeners of the steppe. Their massive feet, broad and calloused, churned the soil, allowing ancient seeds to find purchase. Their grazing habits kept the forests at bay, maintaining the mammoth steppe, a unique high-productivity grassland that stretched from Spain to Siberia, a biome that has no modern equivalent. They were the heartbeat of the North. When they moved, the earth moved. When they breathed, the steam from their trunks created microclimates in the freezing air. They were the silent witnesses to our own awkward evolution, watching us descend from the trees, stand upright, and fumble with the first sparks of fire. But the world that had cradled them was betraying them. The impact of the comet and the subsequent darkening of the sun had triggered a botanical betrayal. The nutritious grasses, the herbs rich in protein and calcium that fueled the massive bodies of the megafauna, began to wither in the low light and the biting cold. In their place grew toxic scrub, mosses, and dwarf birches, plants that were bitter, hard to digest, and devoid of the energy needed to sustain a 6-ton mammal. Consider the biography of the stomach of the last matriarch. She is a creature of immense wisdom, her memory holding the maps of migration routes that have guided her herd for generations. She remembers the sweet valleys where the clover grew thick in the summer. She remembers the salt licks near the river bends. But now, as she leads her dwindling family across the gray, ash-covered tundra, her trunk finds only lichens and wet, freezing mud. Her stomach, a massive fermentation vat designed to turn grass into heat, is failing. The silent error here is metabolic. Her biology is overfitted to a world that no longer exists. She eats constantly, 20 hours a day, her trunk tearing at the woody shrubs, but she is starving. The caloric math no longer works. The energy required to keep her body warm in the 1,000-year winter exceeds the energy she can extract from the dying land. She is walking into a caloric deficit from which there is no return. We, the human observers, watched this tragedy unfold with a complex mixture of hunger, fear, and profound sorrow. The relationship between the hunter and the mammoth was not one of simple predation. It was a spiritual contract. To kill a mammoth was to feed the tribe for months, to build warm shelters from its bones, to craft needles and art from its ivory. It was a gift from the earth. But to watch them die of starvation, to see them stumble and fall without a spear in their side, was a shock to the human psyche. It was a realization that the rules had changed. The gods of the landscape were mortal. Imagine a clan of our ancestors huddled on a limestone ridge overlooking a valley that was once a thoroughfare of giants. They are wrapped in furs that are tattered and gray with soot. They watch as a solitary bull mammoth, his great tusks dragging in the snow, pauses in the middle of the frozen river. He is the ghost incarnate, a shadow of the power he once represented. His coat, once thick and lustrous, hangs in matted clumps, shedding into the wind. He sways, his equilibrium failing as the starvation eats away at his muscle mass. He trumpets, a lonely, mournful sound that echoes off the canyon walls. But there is no answer. The herd is gone. The silence that follows is heavy, pressing against the ears of the watchers. The humans do not cheer. They do not rush down to claim the meat. They stand in a reverent silence, witnessing the passing of an age. They feel, perhaps for the first time, the solastalgia, the deep existential distress caused by the destruction of one's home environment. The death of the mammoth was the death of the world they knew. This extinction was a traumatic severance. It was an amputation of the human experience. We had evolved as the wolf of the mammoth, our strategies, our tools, and our social structures designed around the presence of these giants. Without them, we were unmoored. The easy calories of the great hunt, the high-risk, high-reward strategy of bringing down a single beast to feed the village, were gone. The landscape, once a pantry stocked with mobile mountains of meat, became a desert of small, fleeing shadows. As the giants vanished, they left behind physical monuments to their existence. The thawing permafrost, churned by the erratic climate shifts, began to push the bones of the fallen to the surface. We found them, the curved ribs arching out of the mud like the hull of a wrecked ship, the massive femurs that looked like pillars of stone, and the tusks, those magnificent, spiraling scrolls of ivory. To the Neolithic mind, these were not just bones. They were the hard drive of the Earth's memory. They were the only proof that the Golden Age had existed. We gathered them, not just for tools, but for connection. We built our dwellings from their mandibles and skulls, creating structures that were literally made of the ancestors. We carved their likenesses into the ivory, small figurines that fit in the palm of the hand, rubbing them with red ochre as if to breathe life back into the stone. This was the birth of the relic, the object that holds the power of the past. But nostalgia does not fill the belly. The departure of the mammoth forced a brutal and necessary shift in our biological destiny. The human body, adaptable and desperate, had to undergo a metabolic and behavioral revolution. We could no longer be the brute force hunters of the open plain. The age of the hero, where a single man might confront a beast 10 times his size, was over. The age of the trickster had begun. Survival now depended on the desperate necessity of smaller, swifter prey. The landscape was now populated by the fleet-footed, the reindeer, the hare, the wild horse, and the elusive birds of the wetland. These animals did not stand their ground like the mammoth. They ran. They hid. They understood the art of invisibility. To hunt them required a completely different set of cognitive and physical skills. Consider the biography of the leg in this new era. The human runner had to become lighter, faster, and more enduring. The heavy, explosive muscle needed to thrust a spear into a thick hide gave way to the lean, efficient muscle of the marathon runner. We became creatures of the chase. A day in the life of a post-reset hunter was a day of ceaseless motion. He would wake before dawn, his stomach knotting with the familiar cramp of hunger. He would pick up a spear that was lighter, more balanced, tipped not with a heavy Clovis point, but with microliths, tiny razor-sharp flakes of flint glued into a wooden shaft. These were the tools of precision, not power. He would track a hare through the birch scrub for hours, reading the microscopic signs of its passage, a bent twig, a disturbed patch of moss, a dropping still warm in the snow. This was a battle of wits. The hare was a master of evasion, capable of turning on a dime, vanishing into a burrow, or freezing into perfect camouflage. The hunter had to anticipate, to think like the prey, to project his mind into the future path of the animal. This cognitive load was immense. Hunting the mammoth required courage. Hunting the hare required genius. It demanded patience, that slow, burning virtue that sits in the chest and prevents the muscles from twitching. The evolutionary duality here is striking. By losing the easy calories of the megafauna, we were forced to expand our diet and our minds. We turned to the water. We learned to weave nets from plant fibers, a technology that required abstract thinking and fine motor skills far beyond the needs of the spear. We learned to build weirs to trap fish, turning the flow of the river into a tool. We began to harvest the seeds of the wild grasses, pounding them into a paste, the precursor to bread. We became generalists in the truest sense, eating everything from grubs to roots to fish. This diversification was a survival strategy, but it came at a cost. It required a constant low-level anxiety, a perpetual scanning of the environment for opportunity. We could never rest on the windfall of a single kill. We were always one meal away from hunger. And yet, the ghost of the mammoth lingered. It haunted our stories. The elders would sit by the fire, their eyes milky with age, and tell the children of the mountain that walked. They would describe the sound of the trumpet that shook the snow from the trees. They would mimic the rolling gait of the herd. The children, chewing on the tough meat of a rabbit or the bitter roots of the tundra, would listen with wide eyes, trying to imagine a world where meat was as abundant as the grass. The mammoth became a myth, a symbol of a lost paradise where humanity lived in the shadow of gods. In the silence of the canyons, the wind still carried the echo of their passing. The ecological hole they left was never filled. The birch forests grew thick and tangled without the giants to trample them down. The nutrient cycle of the north slowed, the soil becoming poorer without the massive inputs of dung. The land became quieter, less dynamic, a shadow of its former self. We, the survivors, carried the survivor's guilt in our very DNA. We were the ones who made it through the bottleneck, but we did so by becoming something else. We shed the skin of the Paleolithic big-game hunter and grew the skin of the Mesolithic forager. We became leaner, more agile, and more cunning. We learned to track the fleeting and the hidden, to read the wind for the scent of a fox, to spot the silver flash of a salmon in the murky water. The ghost of the mammoth is not just a metaphor, it is a presence in the modern world. We see it in the way we still revere the elephant, a distant cousin of the lost titan. We see it in our obsession with rewilding, a deep-seated desire to bring back the giants and restore the lost symmetry of the earth. But mostly, we feel it in the silence. When you stand on the high tundra today, or in the vast boreal forests of the north, and you feel that overwhelming, crushing quiet, that is the space where the mammoth used to be. It is the empty room in the house of the world, a vacuum that history has never managed to fill. And so, we walked on, leaving the bones behind in the mud. We walked away from the age of giants and into the age of men, carrying our spears and our nets, our eyes scanning the ground for the small tracks of the future, while our hearts remembered the thunder of the past. The reset was complete. The giants were gone, and we were alone in a world that had suddenly become very large and very empty. To descend into the earth is to travel back in time, to peel away the skin of the present and expose the muscle and bone of the past. Imagine, if you will, the slow, rhythmic scraping of a trowel against the dry, sun-baked wall of an excavation pit. The sound is small, a metallic whisper in the vast silence of a desert canyon, perhaps in the high scrublands of Arizona or the windswept plains of Belgium. Here, the modern world, with its noise, its urgency, and its steel cities, fades into insignificance. We are entering the library of the lithosphere, where the history of our planet is written not in ink, but in layers of sediment, compacted by the weight of millennia. The archaeologist, kneeling in the dust, is a time traveler. The sun beats down on their back, a sensation of warmth that connects them to the ancestors who walked this same ground 12,000 years ago. But the ground itself has changed. As the brush sweeps away the loose grains of sand, a distinct, terrifying feature emerges from the chaotic geology of the trench. It is a line, a thin, dark, almost oily band of black sediment that cuts horizontally across the stratigraphic profile. It is stark, undeniable, and haunting. This is the black mat. To the uninitiated eye, it is merely a change in color, a streak of darker soil in a wall of beige. But to those who know the language of the earth, this line is a scream frozen in stone. It is the physical record of the catastrophe, a geological scar that separates two distinct worlds, two distinct versions of the human story. To touch this layer is to touch a ghost. It feels different from the soil above and below it. It is rich in carbon, slick with the organic decay of 1,000,000 burning forests, and dense with the soot of a world that was incinerated in a single day. It is a boundary, a before and an after, compressed into a few centimeters of dark earth. Below this line, the soil is alive with the evidence of the Golden Age. We find the fossilized pollen of wildflowers that no longer grow in this region, the spores of fungi that thrived in the dung of the great herds, and the white mineralized bones of the mammoth and the camel. Below the line, the earth speaks of abundance. It speaks of a time when the rain fell softly and the grass grew tall. But then comes the darkness. The black mat itself is a suffocating blanket. It represents a moment when the biomass of the continent, the trees, the grasses, the animals, and yes, the people, was consumed by fire and then smothered by ash. And above the line, there is a haunting emptiness. The bones disappear. The Clovis points, those exquisite fluted masterpieces of stone technology, vanish. The pollen count crashes, replaced by the hardy, desperate spores of weeds and algae that grow in stagnant, lifeless water. To trace your finger across this boundary is to feel the pulse of the earth skipping a beat, a moment of cardiac arrest where the biosphere collapsed and held its breath for 1,000 years. Let us look deeper into this ancient memory carved in stone. The black mat is not just ash. It is a celestial crime scene. Buried within this dark layer are the fingerprints of the visitor that came from the void. Scientists, working with microscopes that can see the architecture of the atom, have brushed away the dust of eons to find things that should not belong on the surface of our gentle planet. They find iridium, a heavy, brittle metal that is rare in the Earth's crust, but abundant in the hearts of comets and asteroids. This iridium is the dust of stars, the fallout of cosmic wanderers, sprinkled across the globe like a fine metallic snow. It is a reminder that our blood and our bones are made of the same stuff as the stars, and that sometimes the stars come back to claim us. Even more elusive are the nanodiamonds. These are not the jewels of human vanity, cut and polished for rings and crowns. These are microscopic crystals, hexagonal in structure, smaller than a bacterium. They are born only in moments of unimaginable pressure and heat, moments when the atmosphere is compressed so violently that carbon atoms are crushed into the hardest substance in the universe. We find them by the trillions in this thin black line. They are the invisible jewels of the apocalypse, created in the fraction of a second when the shock wave of the comet slammed into the atmosphere. They are the crystallized memory of the impact, eternal and indestructible, hiding in the dirt beneath our feet. And then there is the melt glass. In the black mat, we find tiny spheres of silica and iron, droplets of rock that were melted and thrown into the sky, where they cooled and rained down as glass beads. To create this scoria, one needs temperatures that rival the surface of the sun, temperatures far hotter than any volcano or forest fire could produce. This is the trinitite of the Pleistocene, the result of the ground itself being turned into liquid fire. When you hold a pinch of this soil, you are holding the evidence of a heat that vaporized glaciers and turned granite into vapor. It is a sobering intimacy to hold the residue of such violence in the palm of a soft, living hand. But the story of the soil is not just a story of rocks and chemistry. It is a biography of the creatures who lived and died on this boundary. Let us imagine the excavation of a specific site, perhaps the famous Murray Springs in Arizona. Here, the black mat lies like a funeral shroud directly over the footprint of the mammoth hunters. We find the bones of a mammoth, immense and silent, lying on its side. But it is not a natural death. The bones are not scattered by scavengers. They are articulated, still in the position of the animal's final fall. And there, intimately associated with the ribs, are the stone tools of the Clovis people. We must pause to consider the biography of the artifact. The Clovis point is one of the most beautiful and sophisticated tools ever created by human hands. It is a leaf-shaped blade, fluted at the base to fit securely into a wooden shaft, chipped from the finest chert, obsidian, or jasper. To make one required a level of skill and cognitive foresight that rivals any modern engineer. The hands that made these points were identical to ours, hands with sensitive fingertips, strong opposable thumbs, and a connection to a brain capable of abstract thought. The napper would have sat by the fire, listening to the rhythm of the strike, feeling the vibration of the stone, turning a raw rock into a survival weapon. At the excavation site, we find these points lying directly beneath the black mat. In some cases, they are found in situ with the mammoth, as if the hunt was interrupted. Imagine the scene. The hunters have brought down the great beast. The adrenaline is fading, replaced by the heavy work of butchery. They are skinning the animal, their knives flashing in the sun. And then the light changes. The sky ignites. The heat rolls over them. The work is abandoned. The mammoth is left half butchered. The tools are dropped. The ash falls. And there they remain, frozen in time, sealed by the black layer for 12,000 years. The black mat is not just a geological layer, it is a photograph of an interrupted meal, a frozen moment of human endeavor cut short by the cosmos. Above this line, the Clovis culture is gone. The distinct, beautiful fluting technology disappears from the archaeological record. It is as if the knowledge itself was incinerated. The people who survived the fire and the flood were different. They made different tools, simpler, less specialized. They were a traumatized population, a people who had lost the luxury of high art and were focused entirely on the desperate scrape for survival. The continuity of culture was severed. The fracture in the soil represents a fracture in the human soul. We lost something in that fire, a confidence, a connection to the megafauna, a way of being in the world that we would never reclaim. The memory in the soil also speaks of the water. The black mat is often found covering the bottom of ancient lake beds or swampy depressions. This tells us of the chill of the flood. After the fire came the water, the melting glaciers turning the landscape into a bog. The layer is often associated with algal mats, thick, slimy carpets of vegetation that grow in stagnant, oxygen-deprived water. This was a world where the rivers stopped flowing and the lakes turned dead and gray. The smell of this era would have been the smell of rot, wet, anaerobic decay. The soil records a time when the lungs of the earth were clogged with mud. We must consider the evolutionary duality of this layer. It is a record of death, yes, but it is also the foundation of our modern world. We, the living, walk upon this layer every day. It lies beneath the foundations of our skyscrapers, beneath the asphalt of our highways, beneath the roots of our crops. We are quite literally built upon the ruins. The soil that nourishes our wheat and corn today is soil that was formed after the reset. The civilization we have built, the cities, the internet, the space stations, is a civilization of the recovery. We are the species that emerged from the ash. If the comet had not struck, if the black mat had not been laid down, the trajectory of life would have been entirely different. Perhaps the mammoth would still roam the plains. Perhaps the Clovis culture would have evolved into something unrecognizable. We are the children of the catastrophe, our history shaped by the fractures and healings of the planet. To the scientist who studies this, the experience is one of profound humility. There is a specific sensation when the trowel hits the black mat. The sound changes, the texture changes. It is smoother, softer, yet more cohesive than the sandy layers above. It feels greasy to the touch, a tactile reminder of the organic material that was vaporized. The archaeologist cleans the surface, exposing the dark line, and in doing so, they are opening a window into the great silence. They are the first human being to see this specific patch of earth since the day the sky fell. It is a sacred act, a communion with the dead. There is a theory, whispered in the quiet corners of academic conferences, that the legends of our oldest cultures, the stories of the Great Flood, the burning sky, the days of darkness, are not metaphors, but memories. They are the oral history of the black mat. The memory in the soil matches the memory in the myth. When we read the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the biblical account of Noah, or the indigenous stories of the Americas describing a sky that rained fire, we are hearing the echo of the event that created this layer. The geology and the mythology are two strands of the same rope, twisting back 12 millennia to the same terrible knot in time. As we stand in the excavation pit, the wind picking up and blowing dust across the newly exposed section, we are forced to confront the fragility of our spark. The black mat is a reminder that the stability we enjoy is an illusion. The Earth is not a static stage, but a dynamic, violent arena. The layer is thin, sometimes only an inch thick, yet it represents a turning point more significant than the rise and fall of Rome. It is a memento mori for the entire human race, a black ribbon tied around the finger of history to remind us that we are guests here, living by the grace of a cosmos that can reset the board at any moment. But there is also hope in the soil. Above the black mat, the earth returns. The color lightens. The pollen returns. The bones of the bison and the elk appear. Life, in its stubborn, beautiful tenacity, pushed through the ash. The healing began. The roots of new plants pierced the black layer, breaking it up, turning the scar into soil. We are the result of that healing. We are the descendants of the ones who looked at the blackened sun and decided to keep walking. We carry the memory of the soil in our own resilience, a species forged in the fire, resting our foundations upon the ash, yet always reaching, with a desperate and beautiful hope, toward the stars that once tried to destroy us. The wind that blew across the post-impact world was a sculptor of despair. It carried the biting grit of the Younger Dryas, a chill that seemed to emanate not just from the ice caps, but from the very void of space itself. For generations, the cold had been a familiar companion, but this was different. This was a sterility, a dryness that turned the lush grasslands into brittle yellow straw and the forests into graveyards of gray timber. The old ways, the sacred, blood-packed rhythms of the hunt, were failing. The great herds, those thundering rivers of protein that had sustained our ancestors for eons, were gone, ghosted into the mist of extinction, or scattered into small, skittish bands that fled at the scent of man. We must visualize the hunter of this twilight era. He stands on a ridge, his silhouette ragged against a slate-gray sky. His spear, tipped with a point that took hours of delicate flaking to perfect, hangs heavy in his hand. It is a tool of magnificent pedigree, a masterpiece of the Paleolithic, but in this new, broken world, it is becoming obsolete. He scans the horizon, his eyes narrowing against the glare of the snow, but there is no movement. The land is empty. The silence is absolute. In his stomach, there is a hollow ache that has become as constant as his heartbeat. He returns to the temporary camp, his shoulders slumped, to face the eyes of his kin, eyes that hold a question he can no longer answer. The covenant between the human and the wild, the promise that, if we seek, we shall find, has been broken. The earth has closed its hand. It was in this crucible of hunger and failure that a subtle shift occurred in the human mind, a desperate mutation of necessity that would rewrite the destiny of the species. It did not happen with a shout or a flash of insight, but in the quiet, gnawing moments of starvation. If the food would not come to us, we realized with a terrifying clarity that we would have to make the food stay. We could no longer simply follow the herds. We had to learn to command the earth itself. The birth of the architect began not with the laying of stone upon stone, but with the restructuring of the human perception of time. For 200,000 years, the human mind had lived in the eternal now. We were creatures of immediate return. We hunted, we ate, we slept. The future was a vague concept, a mist that belonged to the spirits. But the trauma of the comet and the starvation of the great cold forced a cognitive leap. We had to learn to see the invisible. We had to look at a seed, a tiny, hard kernel of grass, and see not a momentary snack, but a future loaf of bread. We had to look at a muddy riverbank and see a garden. We had to hallucinate a harvest in the middle of winter. This was the birth of delayed gratification, a rewiring of the brain's reward centers that was as significant as the development of language. Let us follow the gaze of the gatherer, likely the women and the elders who maintained the deep botanical knowledge of the tribe. While the hunters chased ghosts, the gatherers looked down. They noticed that around the temporary camps, where the waste piles of wild grains had been discarded, new green shoots were rising from the mud. They saw the miracle of the cycle, life rising from decay. In the shadow of the catastrophe, the first seeds were gathered, not for immediate consumption, but for the future. Imagine the sensory experience of this first intentional planting. A woman kneels in the silt of a receding river, perhaps in the Jordan Valley or the crescent of the Levant. The air is cold, but the mud is warm, heated by the first weak rays of the spring sun. She holds a handful of wild einkorn wheat. Her instinct, honed by millions of years of evolution, screams at her to eat it. It is energy. It is survival. But she overrides that instinct. She defies the hunger. With a trembling hand, a hand that is a character in this story, a hand that is learning a new gentleness, she presses the seed into the wet earth. She covers it. She leaves it. This act is a defiance of the chaos. It is a pact made with the future. She is betting her life and the life of her children on the belief that the earth will answer. She is becoming an architect of life. She is no longer a passive witness to the biosphere. She is grasping the controls. This moment, this silent burial of the seed, is the pivot point of history. It is the moment the wanderer begins to die, and the peasant begins to be born. As the seeds took root, so did we. We began to settle by the receding waters, watching how the silt brought forth life. The nomadic loop, the endless walking that had defined our existence, began to tighten. We stayed to weed. We stayed to water. We stayed to protect the green shoots from the gazelle and the mouse. And because we stayed, we had to build. The temporary shelters of skin and branch, designed to be abandoned, were no longer sufficient. We needed permanence. We needed walls that could withstand the wind that had destroyed the world. This was the dawn of the Neolithic, a slow-motion revolution born from the ruins of the Paleolithic. We traded the freedom of the nomad for the security of the hearth. And what a trade it was. To build a house of stone is to anchor oneself to a specific coordinate in space. It is to say to the universe, I am here, and I will not move. Visualizing the first true houses of this era, the round huts of the Natufians, we see the biography of the back begin to change. For eons, the human body had been upright, running, reaching. Now, it began to bend. We spent our days stooped over the earth, clearing rocks, mixing mud for mortar, grinding grain on heavy stone querns. The spine, evolved for the savanna, took on the burden of the settlement. We can see this in the skeletal records, the arthritis in the knees of the women, the compression in the vertebrae of the men. We paid for our security with our bodies. The cost of adaptation was pain, a dull, chronic ache that settled into the joints of the species. But there was also a profound beauty in this new intimacy with the material world. Our fingers learned the texture of soil in a way the hunter never knew. We learned to differentiate between the clay that holds water and the sand that drains it. We learned the rhythm of the seasons, not just as a time to move, but as a time to act. A complex calendar of planting, tending, and harvesting. The mind became a library of phenology, cataloging the swelling of buds, the arrival of rains, the angle of the sun. We became attuned to the micro-movements of a single acre rather than the macro movements of a continent. The architecture was not just physical, it was psychological. When we built the first walls, we created a new dichotomy, the inside and the outside. Before this, the world was one continuous, seamless entity. The cave was just a fold in the rock. The camp was just a pause in the walk. But a wall creates a separation. Inside the wall was the domus, the domain of the human, of order, of safety. Outside the wall was the agrios, the wild, the chaotic, the place where the demons of the comet still lurked. We began to fear the dark in a new way because we now had a light that was ours to protect. The hearth became the center of the universe, a fixed star around which the family orbited. This settling down also birthed the concept of property. In the hunter-gatherer world, you could not own the land any more than you could own the wind. But if you clear the stones, and you plant the seeds, and you build the wall, the land becomes yours. It becomes an extension of your body, a storage vat for your labor. The architecture of society began to fracture. Hierarchies emerged. Those who had the best land or the most seeds or the driest granaries held the power. The Great Reset had leveled the world, but the recovery was building a staircase. In this shadow of the catastrophe, the relationship between the human and the animal also shifted. The wolf, that gray shadow that had stalked the perimeter of the fire for millennia, came closer. In the desperate cold of the Younger Dryas, the wolf was hungry too. It found that near the human settlements, there were scraps. There was warmth. And we found that the wolf had ears that could hear the approach of intruders, and a voice that could sound the alarm. A tentative alliance was formed. We invited the wild into the domus. We became the architects of the wolf's evolution, shaping it into the dog. This was the first biography of the friend, a merging of two apex predators against a hostile world. The dog became the guardian of the granary, the first soldier in the war against the wild. But the most profound architectural shift was not the house, or the granary, or the wall. It was the temple. We must ask, why did we stop wandering? Was it only for food, or was it fear? The trauma of the sky that fell was still fresh in the collective memory. We had seen the heavens turn against us. We had seen the sun die. The human mind, reeling from this cosmic betrayal, sought a way to bargain with the universe. We needed to appease the angry sky. The hunter began to transform into the priest. In the deep time of the Paleolithic, our spirituality was likely animistic. We spoke to the spirit of the bear, the river, the wind. We were equals in a web of life. But after the catastrophe, we looked up. We realized that the power that destroys worlds comes from above. We had to build structures that could speak to the sky. This is the origin of sites like Göbekli Tepe. Massive T-shaped pillars of limestone, weighing tons, dragged by human hands to the top of a hill. They were not houses. They were not forts. They were clocks and altars. We carved the images of the dangerous animals, the scorpions, the lions, the vultures, onto the stone, trapping their spirits in the rock. We built these great circles to track the stars, to predict the movements of the heavens, to ensure that the visitor in the night would not return without warning. We became architects of the sacred. We tried to build a cage for chaos. The physical effort required to build these first temples was immense. It required the cooperation of hundreds of people. It required food to feed the workers. This demand for a surplus of food may have driven the invention of agriculture just as much as hunger did. We farmed to feed the temple builders. We farmed to create an offering for the gods. The sweat of the brow became a holy act. The biography of the shoulder tells the story of dragging these monoliths, the tearing of muscle, the crushing of bone, the sheer brute force of will imposed upon the geology of the earth. As the generations passed, the wanderer faded into a myth. The children born in the stone houses did not know the layout of the distant valleys. They knew the layout of the village. They knew the face of the neighbor. They knew the rules of the harvest. The freedom of the nomad, that vast, unthinking liberty to move with the wind, was traded for the security of the silo. We gained a buffer against the famine. We gained the ability to store time in the form of grain. But we lost the silence of the open world. We surrounded ourselves with the noise of the village, the barking of dogs, the crying of infants, the grinding of stones, the arguments of neighbors. The Great Reset had closed one door and opened another. It locked the door on the Garden of Eden, the wild paradise where food was gathered, not made. And it opened the door to the field, the place of labor, of sweat, of anxiety, and of control. We became the masters of the grass, but we also became its servants. We had to wake when the crop needed water. We had to stay when the crop needed harvest. We were tethered to the soil by a root as strong as the oak. In the biography of the eye, the gaze shifted from the horizon to the furrow. We stopped looking at the distance and started looking at the detail. We became obsessed with the quality of the seed, the dampness of the soil, the signs of rot. The ancient mystery of the world was no longer, "Where will we go tomorrow?" but, "Will the rain come today?" And yet, in this transition, there was a terrible grandeur. We were a species that had been brought to the brink of extinction by a cosmic hammer, and instead of fading away, we decided to rebuild the world in our own image. We took the chaos of the Younger Dryas, and we imposed a grid upon it. We took the mud and made it into a home. We took the wolf and made it into a friend. We took the grass and made it into bread. We became the architects, the builders of a new reality, standing in the ruins of the old world, stacking stone upon stone, seed upon seed, trying to build a fortress that could withstand the sky. The transition was subtle, slow, and irreversible. A day in the life of the first farmer ended not with the sleep of the exhausted hunter under the stars, but with the sleep of the anxious guardian behind a door of woven branches. He would lie on his mat of reeds, listening to the wind howl outside, the same wind that had once been his guide, now his enemy. He would think of the green shoots in the mud, fragile and small, holding the promise of the future. He would touch the stone wall of his house, feeling its cold solidity. He was safe. He was fed. But deep in his dreams, his legs still twitched with the memory of the run, and his soul still wandered the endless, empty, emerald wilderness that was gone forever. The night wind of the Younger Dryas did not merely blow, it mourned. It moved through the valleys of a broken world with a sound like a bow drawn across a frayed string, a low, persistent keen that seemed to carry the voices of the vanished. If we were to sit in the shelter of a limestone overhang 12,000 years ago, huddled against the encroaching frost, we would feel a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with the barometric pressure. It was a psychic weight, a density of sorrow that settled over the human spirit as thick and choking as the ash that covered the snow. The fire in the center of the circle was small, fuel was precious, the great forests having been reduced to splintered graveyards, and its flickering light cast long, dancing shadows against the rock walls. These shadows were the only things that seemed to possess the energy of the old world. The people sitting beneath them were still, their bodies wrapped in the patched furs of animals that were becoming memories, their eyes fixed on the dying embers. This is the setting of the ancestors' grief. It is not a battlefield, nor a hunt, but a quiet, desperate vigil. Here, the elders of the tribe, the ones whose hair had grayed before the sky fell, attempted the impossible task of explaining the unexplainable to the generation born in the dark. We must look closely at the face of one such elder. His skin is a map of exposure, leathery and deep-creased, etched by the suns of the Golden Age and the biting winds of the Great Freeze. His eyes, perhaps clouded with the beginnings of cataracts, hold a 1,000-yard stare that looks through the cave wall, through the ice, and back into a time that his grandchildren cannot conceive. To speak of this grief is to speak of the biography of the throat. For language, in the Paleolithic, was not a casual tool. It was a physical act of creation. The elder's voice would have been gravelly, shaped by the smoke of 1,000 fires, but on this night it trembled. This tremor was not merely age. It was the vibration of trauma. It was the somatic echo of a nervous system that had been overloaded by a stimulus, the blinding light, the roar of the impact, the sudden silence, that it was never designed to process. When he opened his mouth to speak, he was not just telling a story. He was exhaling a pain that had lodged itself in the very center of his chest, a stone of sorrow that no amount of weeping could dissolve. He spoke of the before. To the children, whose only reality was the gray sky and the gnawing hunger, his words must have sounded like the ravings of a fever dream. He told them of a sun that was warm enough to sleep under naked. He told them of days that stretched long and golden, of grass that grew so tall a man could disappear within it, of herds of mammoths so vast they drank the rivers dry. He described the emerald wilderness with a sensory richness that made the children's stomachs ache with a phantom fullness. He spoke of a world where the earth was a generous mother, where the covenant between the hunter and the prey was one of respect, not desperation. But as he spoke, his voice would crack. The biography of the tear is relevant here. The tears that tracked through the soot on his cheeks were not the tears of simple sadness. They were the tears of solastalgia, the profound existential distress caused by the destruction of one's home environment. He was standing on the same ground where he had been born, yet he was an alien in a hostile land. The mountains were the same, but they were buried in ice. The rivers followed the same courses, but they were choked with gray silt. He was mourning the death of the world itself. This was a grief so large it had no container. It spilled out into the atmosphere, becoming the bedrock of the human condition for millennia to come. This oral history, delivered in the dim light of a struggling fire, was the mechanism by which the trauma was encoded into our cultural DNA. The children listened. They absorbed the tremor in the elder's voice, the fear in his eyes, the reverence with which he spoke of the lost son. They did not have the memories of the Golden Age, but they inherited the grief. They learned that the world was fragile. They learned that the gods were capricious. They learned that at any moment, without warning, the great silence could descend again. And so, the eyewitness accounts of the Younger Dryas Impact began their slow, metamorphic journey into mythology. The searing, impossible light that the elder described, the star that broke into pieces and set the atmosphere on fire, was too large for the literal mind to hold. Over generations, as the story was passed from mouth to ear, from grandmother to grandson, the comet became the fiery sword, the war of the gods, or the serpent that ate the sun. The specific physics of the bolide impact, the shock wave, the heat pulse, the vaporization of the ice were wrapped in the protective layers of metaphor. But the core truth remained. When we read the ancient texts today, when we hear of Phaethon losing control of the sun chariot and scorching the earth, or of the Norse Surt flinging fire across the world at Ragnarok, we are hearing the echoed screams of that generation. We are listening to the biography of a nightmare that was dreamt by the entire species simultaneously. Consider the Great Flood. Almost every culture on Earth, from the Sumerians to the Maya, from the First Nations of North America to the tribes of Australia, carries a story of a deluge. For centuries, scholars treated these as isolated fairy tales. But the geology of the black mat and the meltwater pulses of the dying ice age tell us a different story. The elder, sitting by the fire, would have described the feverish boiling tide that followed the fire. He would have told of the day the ocean rose up and swallowed the land, of the great coastal plains of Doggerland vanishing beneath the gray waves, of the rivers reversing their flow and drowning the valleys. To the listening child, this was not geology, it was judgment. Why did the water rise? Why did the fire fall? The human mind, desperate for pattern and meaning, could not accept that this was a random cosmic accident. That was too terrifying. Randomness is a monster that cannot be fought. So, we invented a reason. We invented sin. The elder explained that the people of the Golden Age must have done something wrong. They must have forgotten the old ways, or insulted the spirits, or become too proud. The catastrophe was reframed as a punishment. This shift in worldview was the birth of guilt. We began to look at the sky not with wonder, but with a deep-seated suspicion. We began to walk softly on the earth, afraid that if we stepped too hard, the ground would open up again. The evolutionary duality of this grief is profound. On one hand, it was a crippling burden. The fear of the sky created a species that was chronically anxious, hyper-vigilant, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. It gave us a cortisol response that is triggered by the slightest shadow. But on the other hand, this grief was a survival weapon. The stories of the end of the world served as a warning. They taught the descendants to be prepared. They taught us to store food, to build stronger shelters, to watch the stars for signs of change. The trauma made us paranoid, yes, but it also made us prudent. We survived the long winter because we were terrified of it. The ancestors' grief was the inoculation that saved the species from extinction, a bitter medicine that kept us awake in the deadly cold. Imagine a day in the life of a mother in this era, a daughter of the elder who told the stories. She carries her infant in a sling of woven grass, holding him close to her body heat. As she walks through the skeletal forest, gathering the meager nuts and roots, she constantly scans the horizon. She sees a dark cloud gathering in the north, a simple storm front. But her heart hammers against her ribs, her breath catches. The memory in the blood is activated. She rushes back to the cave, clutching her child, driven by a panic that belongs to her father, not to her. She hides in the dark, covering the child's ears, waiting for the roar that does not come. This is the legacy of the catastrophe, a nervous system that is permanently set to alert, a biology that treats every shadow as a harbinger of the apocalypse. This ancestral sorrow also reshaped our relationship with the divine. In the Golden Age, the spirits were likely seen as partners, the spirit of the elk, the spirit of the berry bush. But after the sky fell, the divine became something to be feared and appeased. The hunter became the supplicant. We began to offer sacrifices, not out of gratitude, but out of terror. We gave up the best of our food, and sometimes in the darkest moments, our own blood, in a desperate attempt to buy safety from the cosmos. The smoke of the offering fire was sent up to signal to the heavens. We are sorry. We are small. Please do not reset the stage again. The architecture of religion was built on the foundation of this trauma, a fortress of ritual constructed to keep the sky from falling. As the centuries passed, the real memories faded into the mists of time. The elder died, and his voice was silenced. The children grew up and became elders themselves, retelling the stories, adding their own embellishments, smoothing the rough edges of the horror into the rhythm of a chant. The blackened sun became a dragon. The meltwater pulse became a global rain. The comet became a war in heaven. But the emotional core remained intact. The sadness lingered in the collective subconscious, a low-frequency hum that vibrated in the background of every civilization that rose from the ashes. We can see this vestige today in our own fascination with the end times. Why are we so obsessed with post-apocalyptic stories? Why do we flock to movies about asteroids, floods, and zombie plagues? It is because we have been there before. We are reenacting the primary trauma of our species. When we watch a city fall on a screen, we are tapping into that ancient memory, scratching at the scar tissue on our cultural soul. We are the survivors of a near-extinction event, and deep down, in the silence of the genome, we know that the stability of our current world is an illusion. The ancestor's grief is also a story of connection. It binds us to every other human being on the planet. The catastrophe was global. The elder shivering in the cave in France had a counterpart in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia. All of humanity passed through this bottleneck together. All of us are descended from the ones who sat in the dark and wept for the sun. This grief is a universal heritage, a shared memory of the moment we almost didn't make it. In the quiet of the night, when the wind howls around the corners of our modern houses, we can still hear the echo of that ancient sorrow. It is the feeling of smallness we get when we look at the stars. It is the sudden, irrational sadness that overtakes us when the leaves fall in autumn. It is the fragility of the spark that we protect with our walls and our lights. We are the children of the grief, carrying the weight of a paradise lost, forever searching for a way back to the garden that vanished in a single night. And yet, there is a strange beauty in this grief, for it was the grief that forced us to cherish what remained. The elder, after finishing his story, would look at the small, sputtering fire. He would look at the faces of the children, dirty, thin, but alive. And he would realize that although the world was broken, it was not finished. The sun was a ghost, but it still rose. The mammoth was gone, but the hair remained. The grief was the soil in which a new kind of love grew, a fierce, protective love for the fragile, fleeing moment of existence. We learned to love the light because we had known the dark. We learned to value the warmth because we had known the cold. The ancestor's grief was the heavy price we paid for the wisdom of survival, a debt we are still paying, one story at a time, as we sit by our own fires and try to explain the world to the ones who come after us. The silence of the post-impact world was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that settled over the northern hemisphere like a shroud of lead. To understand the story of our own bodies, we must first immerse ourselves in the absolute, terrifying quietude of the Younger Dryas. Imagine standing on the edge of a frozen lake in what is now the Yukon or the Siberian steppe. The wind has ceased. The birds, those chaotic heralds of the morning, are gone. The great herds of mammoth and bison, which once thundered across the land like living storms, have been reduced to ghostly fragments, swallowing their breath in the mist. In this silence, the primary sound is the internal rhythm of the human body, the slow, heavy thud of the heart, the rasp of breath in the lungs, and the hollow, gnawing complaint of the empty stomach. This was the stage upon which the greatest biological gamble of our history was played. It was a world stripped of its abundance, a world where the golden age of the hunt had been replaced by a gray, starving reality. And in this theater of scarcity, the human genome began to rewrite itself. We often think of evolution as a slow, gradual ascent, a ladder climbed over millions of years. But sometimes evolution is a fire drill. Sometimes it is a brutal, rapid culling where the rules of the game change overnight. When the sky fell and the sun darkened, the biology that had served our ancestors well, the lean, high-energy metabolism of the apex predator, suddenly became a liability. The shield of the genome was not forged in comfort. It was hammered out on the anvil of starvation. We must look deep into the microscopic machinery of our own cells to understand the hero of this story, a character often maligned in our modern age, but revered by the ancients, the fat cell. In the biography of the body, the adipocyte, the fat storage cell, is the silent guardian. In the lush days of the Pleistocene summer, these cells were modest, waiting in the background while the muscles did the work of the hunt. But as the 1,000-year winter descended, the adipocyte became the most important organ in the human body. It was the battery of life. Those individuals who could not store energy, whose metabolisms burned hot and fast, found themselves at a fatal disadvantage. They were like fires that burned through their wood too quickly, leaving only ash when the blizzard struck. But there were others, mutants of a sort, possessors of a silent error in the code of life, whose bodies were miserly. These were the hoarders of the physiological world. Their bodies treated every calorie not as fuel for the moment, but as a treasure to be buried. Let us visualize the chemistry of this survival. Imagine a young woman of the clan, huddled under a shelter of reindeer skins as the temperature outside plummets to 40 degrees below zero. She has not eaten a full meal in 3 days. Her brother, a man of powerful build and restless energy, is shivering violently, his body burning through its reserves in a desperate attempt to generate heat. He is gaunt, his eyes sunken, his spirit fraying at the edges. But the woman possesses a subtle shift in her hormonal architecture. Her insulin levels are high. Her body is resistant to letting go of its reserves. She is lethargic, perhaps, moving with a slowness that conserves every ounce of effort. Deep within her tissues, her fat cells are locking their doors, refusing to release their stored energy until the absolute last moment. To the modern eye, she might appear sluggish. To the eye of evolution, she is a masterpiece of efficiency. She is the thrifty genotype, the vessel that will carry the spark of humanity through the long night. This thrifty gene was not a single switch, but a complex symphony of biological adjustments. It was a survival weapon forged in the fires of the Younger Dryas. It changed the way we perceive hunger. In a world of plenty, hunger is a signal to eat. In the world of the blackened sun, hunger was a constant state of being, a background noise that the mind had to learn to ignore. The survivors were those whose brains could dampen the panic of starvation, who could slip into a metabolic hibernation, lowering their body temperature and slowing their pulse to match the frozen rhythm of the earth. We learned to become like the bear in the cave, turning inward, living off the ghosts of meals past. Consider the day in the life of this metabolic struggle. A hunter finds a singular prize, a nest of waterfowl eggs hidden in the reeds of a freezing marsh. He cracks one open and swallows the yolk. In that instant, a frantic chemical signal races through his blood. It is a scream of relief from the cells. The pancreas releases a flood of insulin, the gatekeeper of the body's energy. In the thrifty individual, this insulin acts with aggressive speed. It grabs the sugar from the yolk and rushes it not to the muscles for immediate use, but to the fat stores. It says to the body, "Hide this, save this. The dark is coming back." The body prioritizes storage over activity. The hunter feels a wave of fatigue after eating, a heaviness that pins him to the earth. This is not laziness. It is the shield raising itself. The body is forcing him to rest, to conserve, to bank the fire so that it might burn through the night. This adaptation created a profound evolutionary duality. In the context of 12,000 years ago, the ability to gain weight easily was a superpower. It was the difference between seeing the spring thaw and freezing in the dark. A layer of subcutaneous fat was not a vanity issue. It was a thermal wetsuit, a barrier against the wind that sought to steal the body's heat. It was armor. The love handles and the belly fat that modern humans battle against were, in the deep time of our history, the sacred reservoirs of life. They were the reason a mother could continue to nurse her child when she herself had not eaten for a week. They were the reason a father could walk for 3 days in the snow to find help. We must reframe our understanding of our own flesh. Every ounce of stored energy on the human frame is a physical echo of a time when the world tried to kill us. But nature is a strict accountant, and every adaptation comes with a cost. The cost of the thrifty gene was a heightened sensitivity to scarcity that bordered on paranoia. Our bodies learned to panic at the slightest sign of caloric deficit. The fear of the famine was written into our hormonal responses. When we diet today, when we voluntarily restrict our food, our ancient biology does not understand. It does not see a desire to be slim. It sees the Younger Dryas returning. It sees the ice sheet advancing. And so, it fights back. It lowers the metabolism. It increases the hunger hormones, ghrelin and leptin, screaming at the brain to find high-calorie food now. It is a biological PTSD, a flashback to the trauma of the extinction event. We are fighting a war against our own history, trying to silence a survival mechanism that saved our ancestors' lives. Let us step back and look at the landscape of the genome as a vast, dark forest. In this forest, the silent errors or mutations are like wandering paths. Most lead nowhere. But the path of the thrifty gene led to the only bridge across the chasm of the catastrophe. The individuals who walked this path, our direct ancestors, were the ones who could endure the erratic food supplies. They were the ones who could eat a mammoth in the autumn and carry that energy on their hips through the starving months of February and March. The genetic lines of the lean and the fast-burning were severed, lost to the snowdrifts, their stories ending in the silence of the ice. We are the children of the survivors. We are the descendants of the toughest, the most adaptable, and the most fortunate. The shield of the genome also extended to our immune systems. The scarcity of food weakened the body's defenses, making the populations vulnerable to disease. But the cold acted as a sterilizing force, suppressing the pathogens that thrived in the warmth. A strange trade-off occurred. We became more resilient to the cold, but perhaps more vulnerable to the diseases of the crowd. As we huddled together in our caves and pit houses, sharing breath and warmth, our immune systems had to learn a new language. They had to distinguish between the self and the other in a much more intimate environment. The inflammation response, the body's way of fighting infection with heat, became more aggressive. This, too, is a legacy we carry. The chronic inflammation that plagues modern humans is a vestige of an immune system that was dialed up to 11, ready to fight a bacterial invasion in a body weakened by hunger. The memory in the cell is not a metaphor. It is a physical reality called epigenetics. The trauma of the starvation experienced by our ancestors left chemical markers on their DNA like sticky notes on a blueprint, telling the genes how to express themselves. These markers were passed down from mother to child, carrying the message: be careful, the world is harsh, store everything. A child born in the spring of the Younger Dryas entered the world with a metabolism already primed for hardship, inheriting the ghostly memory of a winter they had not yet seen. This transgenerational transmission of trauma ensured that the species remained vigilant, that the biological shield remained raised even when the sun returned. Imagine the sensory details of a night in this era. The smell of the air is distinct. It lacks the scent of pine or flower, carrying only the metallic tang of ozone and the damp, earthy smell of thawing mud. The family sleeps in a puppy pile, a tangle of limbs and furs, sharing the precious commodity of body heat. You can hear the slow, rhythmic breathing of the group. It is a sound of endurance. Deep inside the bodies of these sleepers, the mitochondria, the power plants of the cells, are working with ruthless efficiency. They are extracting every last electron from the meager fuel available, creating heat without wasting a single spark. It is a biological miracle, a silent, microscopic victory occurring billions of times a second. This shield protected us, but it also shaped our culture. Because we were biologically driven to hoard energy, we became culturally driven to hoard resources. The scarcity mindset that permeates human history, the drive to accumulate wealth, land, and power, may have its roots in this metabolic trauma. We hoard gold and grain in the same way our bodies hoard fat, as a hedge against the return of the Great Silence. We are a species that finds it difficult to believe that the good times will last, because for 1,000 years, they didn't. As the centuries of the Younger Dryas dragged on, a slow, grinding selection pressure refined the human form. We became somewhat smaller than our Paleolithic ancestors. The towering height of the early modern humans, fueled by the Megafauna protein, was reduced. We became more compact, realizing that a smaller body requires less fuel to heat. We became the people of the compact frame, a physical testament to the law of thermodynamics. Our bones became slightly lighter, our muscle mass slightly reduced, a necessary sacrifice to lower the caloric overhead of staying alive. We traded the body of the Greek god for the body of the survivor. And yet, in this reduction, there was a terrible beauty. The human spirit did not shrink, it condensed. The art of this period, though rare, shows a focus on the essential. The unnecessary was stripped away. The shield of the genome allowed the mind to continue its work. Even in the depths of the hunger, we were inventing. We were refining the needle. We were perfecting the fishhook. We were discovering the secrets of the clay. The fat cells kept the brain alive, that hungriest of all organs, ensuring that the light of consciousness did not flicker out in the wind. Today, we walk through the aisles of supermarkets, surrounded by walls of colorful, calorie-dense food. We live in an environment of perpetual summer, where the temperature is controlled by thermostats and the food supply is limitless. But our bodies are still living in the Younger Dryas. When we eat a sugary donut, our ancient pancreas weeps with joy and panic, flooding the system with insulin, desperate to save this rare gift. When we sit on the couch, our body nods in approval, thinking, "Good, you are conserving energy. You will survive the winter." We are living in a mismatched disease, a conflict between our Stone Age biology and our Space Age environment. But before we judge our bodies for their failures, for the obesity, the diabetes, the lethargy, we should pause and offer a moment of gratitude. We should look at our own skin, at the soft layers of tissue that cover our ribs, and recognize them for what they are, a badge of honor. They are the reason we are here. They are the physical evidence that our ancestors were the ones who made it. They are the shield of the genome, the ancient silent guardian that stood between our lineage and the abyss of extinction. The Thrifty gene is not a flaw. It is a hero that has outlived its war. It is a soldier standing guard in an empty field, waiting for an enemy that has, hopefully, gone forever. But as long as we carry this code in our blood, we are connected to the ice. We are connected to the silence. And we are connected to the enduring, stubborn, magnificent will of life to continue, no matter how cold the night becomes. To lift the human gaze from the earth to the heavens is an act of biological defiance. For millions of years, the primate eye was trained on the horizon, on the branch, on the predator, in the tall grass. Our visual cortex was sculpted by the needs of the terrestrial, the ripe fruit, the leopard's shadow, the expression on a rival's face. To look up, to truly crane the neck back and stare into the abyss of the night for hours on end, is an unnatural posture. It exposes the throat, the most vulnerable architecture of the body, to the dark. It unbalances the inner ear. It requires a stillness that is contrary to the twitchy, reactive nervous system of a prey animal. Yet after the catastrophe, this is exactly what we did. The night sky, once a blanket of comforting stories and familiar campfires of the ancestors, had transformed. It was no longer a passive dome. It was a loaded weapon. In the wake of the impact, when the dust finally settled and the bruised atmosphere thinned enough to reveal the cosmos again, the stars did not look the same. They were no longer just distant lights. They were sentinels that required constant paranoid observation. The birth of astronomy was not rooted in curiosity, nor in the romance of exploration. It was rooted in terror. It was the desperate, trembling need to know if the visitor, that jagged fragment of chaos that had murdered the world, would ever return. We became a species of insomniacs, watchers of the dark, forever scanning the black ocean above for the ripple of an approaching shark. Imagine the atmosphere of a night in the Fertile Crescent, 10,000 years ago, just as the ice was beginning to loosen its grip on the northern latitudes. The air is still cold, carrying the memory of the glacial maximum, but the scent of wild einkorn and pistachios is returning to the wind. A figure stands on a high plateau, wrapped in the thick pelts of wolf and gazelle. He is the first astronomer, though he would not know the word. He is the keeper of the count. He stands motionless, his breath pluming in the starlight, his head tilted back at a painful angle. Consider the biography of the neck in this moment. The cervical vertebrae, usually stacked to support a forward gaze, are compressed. The muscles of the trapezius are locked in a spasm of tension. He has stood this way for hours, tracking the slow, silent wheeling of the constellations. He is looking for anomalies. He is looking for a star that moves, a wanderer that breaks the sacred order of the ecliptic. His eyes, those watery spheres of jelly and nerve, are pushed to their limit. The pupils are dilated so wide they are almost painful, drinking in every photon of light from the center of the galaxy. He is trying to impose order on chaos. He is trying to build a cage of mathematics around the monster in the sky. This fear was the mortar of the first temples. We did not build the great stone circles to worship the gods out of love. We built them to bind the gods with laws. We needed to predict their movements. If we could predict where a star would be 10 years from now, perhaps we could prove to ourselves that the universe was stable. Perhaps we could sleep again. Out of this psychological necessity, Göbekli Tepe rose from the dust. It is a site of staggering ambition, a project that defies the logic of the hunter-gatherer economy. In a time when calories were still scarce, when the memory of the starvation was still fresh, our ancestors gathered by the hundreds to move mountains. They climbed the limestone hill in what is now southern Turkey, a vantage point that commands a view of the horizon in all directions. Here, they began to carve the bedrock. Listen to the sound of this construction. It is the rhythmic chink, chink, chink of flint against limestone, a sound that rang out across the valley for centuries. There was no metal, no wheel, no beast of burden. There was only the human hand, the stone hammer, and the terrifying motivation of the trauma. They quarried pillars that weighed 10, 20, 50 tons. These were T-shaped monoliths, abstract representations of the human form, faceless giants standing in a circle, holding hands, forming a defensive shield against the outside world. To touch the surface of one of these pillars today is to feel the vibration of an ancient anxiety. The stone is not smooth. It is alive with relief carvings. And what did they carve? They did not carve scenes of domestic life, of children playing, or of the harvest. They carved monsters. They carved the predators of the dark, the lion, the scorpion, the spider, the snake, and the vulture. These were not merely animals of the earth. They were the animals of the sky. They were constellations. The scorpion was likely the constellation we now call Scorpio. The vulture may have been Cygnus or Lyra. These pillars were star maps. They were a library of the night, a stone encyclopedia of the things that watch us. Let us focus on Pillar 43, the famous vulture stone. Here, the scientific discovery as story comes into sharp relief. Carved into the limestone is a complex scene involving a scorpion, a vulture holding a disc, or a head, and a headless man. For decades, archaeologists saw this as a ritual scene of sky burial, where birds strip the flesh from the dead. And perhaps it is. But look closer. The positioning of the animals matches the positioning of the constellations at a specific date. Computer models suggest this pillar is a stamp in time, a memorial to the date the sky fell. It is a date stamp for 10,950 BC, the exact time the comet fragments struck the Earth and triggered the Younger Dryas. This pillar is not just art. It is a warning sign. It is a do not forget notice carved in geology. The headless man represents the humanity that was decapitated by the event. The vulture is the death that came from the Cygnus meteor stream. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were trying to freeze the moment of the apocalypse in stone to ensure that the memory of the visitor would never be eroded by the wind. They were saying to the future, "Look up, watch the vulture. It is from there that the fire comes." The evolutionary duality of this new obsession with the stars was profound. On one hand, it gave us the calendar. By tracking the helical rising of Sirius or the position of the Pleiades, we learned to predict the seasons with absolute precision. We knew exactly when the gazelle would migrate, when the wild wheat would ripen, when the rains would return. This was a massive survival advantage. The technology of time allowed us to maximize our resources, to plan, to coordinate large gatherings. It was the birth of the intellectual mind, the shift from the reactive brain to the predictive brain, but the cost was a permanent severance from the eternal now. Before the catastrophe, time was a circle. It was a gentle loop of day and night, summer and winter. After the catastrophe, time became a line. It became a countdown. We began to obsess over the great year, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, the precession of the equinoxes, that takes 26,000 years to complete. We realized that the sky was slowly changing, that the pole star was not permanent, that the universe was a restless, shifting machine. This knowledge brought with it a deep, existential dread. If the sky could change, if the stars could drift, then nothing was safe. The ancient mystery of the cosmos became a source of neurosis. We became a species obsessed with cycles, forever looking for the pattern that would predict the next disaster. A day in the life of the temple builder was a day of rigorous breaking labor, fueled by the fear of the night. Imagine a young man, his hands calloused and white with limestone dust, dragging a sled of timber up the hill. He is tired, his muscles burning, but he does not stop. He looks at the priest, the watcher, who stands in the center of the circle, directing the alignment of the stones. The priest is a figure of terrifying authority. He holds the secret knowledge. He knows where the sun will rise on the solstice. He knows the silent error in the code of the sky. The young builder believes that if the stone is not placed perfectly, if the alignment is off by a fraction of a degree, the sun might not return. The walls of the temple are not just physical barriers. They are metaphysical levees built to hold back the flood of darkness. As the sun sets over the Anatolian plain, the work stops, but the vigilance begins. The fires are lit, casting long, flickering shadows against the pillars. The carvings seem to move in the firelight. The snakes slither, the boars charge, the vultures spread their wings. The tribe gathers in the center of the enclosure. The air is thick with the smell of burning juniper and the metallic scent of fear. They are waiting for a specific star to appear in the aperture of a porthole stone. When it does, a tiny, diamond-hard point of light perfectly framed by the rock, a collective sigh goes through the crowd. The order holds. The math is correct. We have survived another night. This transition turned us into time binders. We began to bury our dead within the floors of our houses, and later, within the shadow of these great stone circles. We wanted the ancestors to be part of the watch. We wanted their spirits to help guard the perimeter. The biography of the skull becomes relevant here. In the Neolithic, we see the rise of the skull cults, the preservation and decoration of human skulls. We plastered them with clay to make them look alive, placing cowrie shells in the eye sockets. Why? Perhaps to give the ancestors permanent, unblinking eyes. Even in death, they were required to watch. We needed every pair of eyes we could get, living or dead, to scan the horizon. The invention of the constellation was itself a psychological defense mechanism. The sky is actually a chaos of stars, a three-dimensional scattering of fusion reactors separated by light years of void. There is no line connecting Orion's belt. There is no bear in the north. The human mind drew those lines. We played a game of celestial connect the dots to make the sky look familiar. We imposed our own stories, our own animals, our own heroes onto the void. By turning the chaos of the stars into a storybook, we made it less terrifying. We domesticated the night sky. We turned the abyss into a ceiling painted with pictures. This was a silent error of perception, a cognitive illusion that allowed us to cope with the sheer scale of the universe. As the centuries passed, the terror slowly morphed into reverence and then into science. The Watchers became the priesthood, and the priesthood became the astronomers. The stone circles of Göbekli Tepe were buried. Deliberately, it seems, under tons of refuse, as if the machine had served its purpose or had become too dangerous to leave open. But the legacy remained. The obsession with alignment traveled west, to the plains of Salisbury where Stonehenge would rise, and south to the sands of Egypt, where the pyramids would align with the belt of Orion. The Great Reset had set a ball rolling that would never stop. It launched the human mind on a trajectory of calculation that would eventually lead to the telescope, the satellite, and the space station. But even today, the vestige of that ancient fear remains. When a comet appears in the sky, like Hale-Bopp or Neowise, we feel a primitive stir. We stop our cars. We look up. We feel a strange mixture of awe and unease. We are the descendants of the ones who saw the wandering star turn into a sun. We carry the cultural DNA that warns us that a light in the sky can change everything. The stars as sentinels also changed our internal world. By constantly looking up, we began to feel small. The biography of the ego took a hit. In the Golden Age, we were the masters of the landscape, the cleverest animals on the savannah. But against the backdrop of the precession of the equinoxes, against the cold indifference of the Milky Way, we were nothing. We were dust. This realization birthed a new kind of spirituality, not of partnership with nature, but of submission to the cosmos. We began to ask, what do the stars want from us? We invented astrology, the belief that our destiny is written in the lights. We tried to abdicate responsibility for our lives, handing it over to the movements of the planets, hoping that if we followed the script of the sky, we would be safe. So, the next time you find yourself standing under a clear, dark sky, away from the city lights, and you feel the urge to tilt your head back and find the North Star, remember that you are performing a ritual that is 12,000 years old. You are mimicking the posture of the first terrified survivors of the apocalypse. Your eyes are tracing the same lines that the builders of Göbekli Tepe carved into the rock. You are a watcher of the dark, carrying the torch of an ancient vigilance, forever seeking to find order in the chaos of a universe that once shattered our world with a single, wandering spark. We look up not just to see where we are, but to ensure that the sky is still where it is supposed to be. The modern world is a veneer, a thin, glittering skin of glass and concrete stretched tight over the ancient muscle of the earth. We move through canyons of steel, illuminated by the artificial bioluminescence of neon and LED, believing ourselves to be creatures of the future, untethered from the mud and the blood of our origins. We sit in climate-controlled rooms, the air filtered and tempered to a perpetual 72 degrees, staring into the blue light of screens that hold the knowledge of the world. We drive machines that move faster than the cheetah, and we fly higher than the eagle. To the casual observer, the human of the 21st century has transcended the biological limitations of the Pleistocene. We appear to be the masters of our domain, the architects of a reality where hunger, cold, and darkness have been banished to the realm of history. But if you strip away the suit, the smartphone, and the car, you find the same animal that shivered in the caves of the Dordogne. You find a biology that has not changed in 40,000 years, a nervous system that is still calibrated to the rustle of the saber-tooth in the grass and the sudden terrifying silence of the birds before a storm. We are wearing the costume of the space age, but our bodies are still living in the Stone Age, and more specifically, we are living in the shadow of a specific trauma. We are the children of the Great Reset. We walk through our modern lives carrying the ghost markings of the Younger Dryas, that 1,000-year winter that nearly extinguished our flame. The modern vestige is not a useless appendix or a wisdom tooth. It is the fundamental operating system of our society, a suite of behaviors, anxieties, and cravings that make no sense in a world of abundance, but make perfect sense in a world that was once murdered by the sky. Consider the biography of the panic. It begins in the morning, often before the sun has risen. The alarm clock rings, a sharp, jarring sound that mimics the warning call of a primate. The heart rate spikes. Cortisol, the stress hormone that once prepared our ancestors to sprint away from a short-faced bear, floods the bloodstream. But there is no bear. There is only a commute. There is only a deadline. Yet the body reacts with the same visceral intensity. We sit in traffic, trapped in metal boxes, our muscles tense, our jaws clenched. This is the fight-or-flight response, a survival mechanism forged in the wild, now firing misfires in the captivity of the highway. We are hyper-vigilant, scanning the lanes for threats, reacting to the aggression of others with a flash of rage that feels disproportionate. This is the scarcity mindset of the survivor, the deep-seated belief that space is limited, that resources are finite, and that if we do not fight for our position in the lane, we will be left behind in the dust of the migration. As we arrive at our offices, those high-rise caves of glass, we seek the hearth. We gravitate toward the break room, toward the coffee machine, the modern equivalent of the tribal fire. We gather there, holding warm cups in our hands, not just for the caffeine, but for the thermal comfort. The sensation of a hot liquid sliding down the throat is a primal reassurance. It signals to the deep brain that we are safe, that we have mastered the element of fire, that the internal temperature will be maintained. In the fluorescent hum of the workplace, we navigate social hierarchies that are identical to the politics of the clan. We seek the approval of the alpha. We fear expulsion from the group. The fear of being fired is not just a financial fear, it is the ancient biological terror of exile. In the Pleistocene, to be cast out of the tribe was a death sentence. To be alone on the tundra was to freeze. And so, when we feel social anxiety, when we worry about our status, we are feeling the echo of that ancient cold blowing against our backs. But the most profound vestige of the Younger Dryas lies in our relationship with food. We walk into a supermarket, a cathedral of infinite calories. The aisles are stocked with brightly colored packages, fruits from every continent, meats cured and preserved against rot. To the thrifty gene that saved our ancestors, this is not a store. It is a miracle. It is a hallucination. The brain, conditioned by the blackened sun and the long famine, lights up with a dopamine response that is almost narcotic. It sees the sugar, the fat, the salt, the unholy trinity of survival nutrients, and it screams, "Eat this! Eat all of this!" The winter is coming. We reach for the donut, not because we are weak, but because we are survivors. The biography of the pancreas remembers the starvation. It remembers the mothers who died because they could not store enough fat to nurse their infants. It remembers the hunters who collapsed in the snow. And so, it demands that we store energy. It fights against our modern desire to be thin with a ferocity that is millions of years old. When we diet, when we restrict calories, the body perceives it as the return of the catastrophe. It lowers the metabolism. It makes us lethargic. It heightens our sense of smell, making every bakery scent a siren song. We are fighting a war against our own success, battling a biological defense system that was designed to save us from an ice age that ended 12 millennia ago. The obesity epidemic is not a failure of will. It is a tragic mismatch between a body built for the apocalypse and a world built for comfort. This trauma is also encoded in our architecture. Why do we live the way we do? Why do we build walls? In the golden age before the comet, our ancestors likely lived in open, ephemeral camps, moving with the wind, their boundaries porous. But after the sky fell, we stopped moving. We built the domus. We built thick walls of stone and brick. We installed heavy doors and intricate locks. We created the concept of private property. Look at the modern home. It is a fortress. It is a bunker. We stock our pantries with cans of food that can last for years. We fill our freezers with meat. We install security systems that monitor the perimeter with unblinking electronic eyes. We are preppers by nature. The drive to hoard, to accumulate stuff, is a direct response to the time when everything was taken away. The clutter in our homes is a hedge against scarcity. The garage full of tools we never use, the closet full of clothes we never wear. These are not signs of materialism, but of fear. The deep brain whispers, "Keep it. You might need it when the stores close. You might need it when the grid goes down." We are soothing the anxiety of the survivor by surrounding ourselves with physical objects. We are building a nest that is impervious to the chaos of the universe. The coziness we seek, the Danish concept of hygge, with its blankets, candles, and warm socks, is a ritualistic reenactment of the safety of the cave during the Younger Dryas. When the wind howls outside and the rain lashes against the glass, and we are tucked inside with a warm blanket, we feel a deep, resonant satisfaction. It is the satisfaction of having beaten the elements. It is the cellular memory of the night we didn't freeze. And then there is the weather itself. Even in our climate-controlled cities, we are still slaves to the barometer. When the pressure drops before a storm, many of us feel a physical shift, a headache, an ache in the old injuries, a vague sense of unease. This is the biography of the joint, the biography of the sinus. Our bodies are living barometers, tuned to detect the shifts in the atmosphere that could signal a blizzard or a flood. When the sky turns that specific bruised purple-gray before a thunderstorm, a primal part of us freezes. We stop what we are doing. We look up. We feel the ancient shiver. It is the shadow of the comet. It is the memory of the day the blue sky turned to fire. We are fascinated by storms, by hurricanes, by blizzards. We watch the Weather Channel with a religious intensity, tracking the path of the destruction. We are the watchers, still scanning the horizon for the return of the visitor. This fascination extends to our storytelling. Look at our cinema. Look at the stories we pay billions of dollars to watch. We are obsessed with the end of the world. Asteroid impacts, alien invasions, zombie pandemics, climate collapses. Why? Why do we want to see our civilization destroyed over and over again in high-definition CGI? It is because we are traumatized. We are replaying the original scene of our collective history. Freud called this the repetition compulsion, the need to reenact a trauma in an attempt to master it. When we watch the tidal wave swallow the city or the meteor strike the ocean, we are looking at our own past. We are processing the grief of the ancestors. We are sitting in the dark theater, which is just a modern cave, and watching the shadows on the wall, telling ourselves the story of how we survived. It is a form of therapy. It is a way of saying, the world ended once, and we are still here. If it ends again, we will survive that too. The prepper movement, the desire to build bunkers in New Zealand, the obsession with Mars colonization, these are not fringe behaviors. They are the logical endpoint of the Younger Dryas psychology. Elon Musk's desire to make humanity a multi-planetary species is the ultimate insurance policy against another impact. It is the Thrifty gene applied to the scale of the cosmos. We want to put our eggs in more than one basket because we know, with a deep genetic certainty, that the basket can be dropped. We know that the Earth is fragile. We know that the long summer of the Holocene is a temporary reprieve. Even our economy is built on this scar tissue. Capitalism, with its focus on growth, accumulation, and future-proofing, is a system designed by a species terrified of running out. The stock market is a graph of our collective anxiety. We save for retirement not just to enjoy our old age, but because we fear the winter of life. We buy insurance for our houses, our cars, our lives. We are constantly hedging against disaster. We find it impossible to live in the now because the now was once the moment the sky fell. We are always living in the future, planning, predicting, worrying. The freedom of the nomad, who lived day to day with faith in the land, is gone. It was burned away by the heat of the impact. We are the children of the accountants, the planners, the ones who built the granaries. But there is a duality here as well. This trauma gave us civilization. It gave us the drive to build the glass and steel cities. If we had remained in the garden, confident in the eternal abundance of nature, we might never have stacked a stone. We might never have invented the wheel, the written word, or the vaccine. The anxiety was the engine of our ascent. The fear of the dark drove us to invent the light bulb. The fear of the hunger drove us to crack the genetic code of wheat. The fear of the cold drove us to split the atom. We are a species that was kicked out of paradise, and in our anger and our fear, we decided to build a new paradise with our own hands. We are the architects of the recovery. And yet, the cost is high. We are a lonely species. We have walled ourselves off not just from the wind, but from each other. The village has fragmented into the apartment. The tribe has fragmented into the nuclear family, and further into the individual. We have traded connection for security. We sit in our boxes, bathed in the blue light of our screens, scrolling through the lives of others, feeling a phantom hunger for a community we have lost. We have full bellies, but empty hearts. We have warm houses, but cold souls. This is the modern vestige, the lingering ache of the separation. We are safe, yes, but we are also in mourning. We are mourning the loss of the mammoth. We are mourning the loss of the silence. We are mourning the loss of the time when we were just another animal in the ecosystem before we had to become the masters of the world. But let us bring this back to the body, to your body, as you lie here, drifting towards sleep. You are the end point of this story. You are the success. Every cell in your body is a survivor. Your metabolism, with its stubborn refusal to let go of energy, is a champion. Your anxiety, with its constant scanning for threats, is a guardian. Your desire for warmth and comfort is a wisdom. You are carrying the baton that was passed from the hand of the shivering hunter in the snow to the hand of the farmer in the mud, to the hand of the builder in the stone circle, all the way to you. Feel the blanket over you. That weight is the memory of the furs that kept your ancestors alive. Feel the warmth of the room. That heat is the victory over the Younger Dryas. Listen to the wind outside or the hum of the city. That is the world that tried to kill you, held at bay by the walls your lineage built. You can rest now. The visitor is gone. The sky is quiet. The black mat is buried deep beneath the earth, covered by 12,000 years of soil and life. The sun will rise tomorrow, not as a ghost, but as a star. You have earned this rest. You have earned this safety. In the silence of the genome, the alarm bells are finally quieting down. The thrifty gene can relax. The watchful eye can close. The scar tissue of the civilization is strong enough to hold you. You are the modern vestige, the living monument to the resilience of the human spirit. You are the one who made it through the fire, through the flood, through the ice, and into the dream. The long winter is over. The spring is here. Sleep now, in the warmth of the world you have built. As we draw the curtain on this journey through the deep time of our species, let us pull back our focus. Let us float upward, leaving behind the glass and steel of the modern city, leaving behind the buried stone circles of Göbekli Tepe, leaving behind the dark, sediment-rich line of the black mat. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the earth as it is now, a blue marble spinning in the vast, silent theater of space. From this vantage point, high above the atmosphere, the scars of history are invisible. You cannot see the borders of nations, nor the ruins of the temples, nor the graves of the mammoths. You see only the thin blue line, that fragile, glowing halo of atmosphere that protects the biosphere from the infinite cold of the void. It breathes. It swells with the heat of the day and contracts with the cool of the night. A planetary lung inhaling and exhaling in a rhythm that has persisted for 4.5 billion years. The comet of 12,000 years ago, that celestial visitor that screamed out of the dark to rewrite our destiny, has long since vanished. Its volatile ices have melted into the oceans, becoming part of the water you drink, part of the rain that falls on the roof. Its dust, the pulverized rock and ancient stardust that once choked the sun and turned the day into twilight, has settled. It has been incorporated into the soil, taken up by the roots of plants, eaten by animals, and woven into the very fabric of the biosphere. In a very literal sense, the comet is no longer a foreign body. It is us. The iridium that was forged in the heart of a dying star and delivered to Earth in a moment of cataclysm now flows in microscopic trace amounts through the blood of every living thing. We are the graveyard of the impact, and we are the garden that grew from it. The impact remains the silent narrator of our journey, a ghostwriter that edited the script of human evolution when we least expected it. We often think of our history as a story of our own making, a tale of heroic conquest and invention. But the great silence reminds us that we are also the products of chance. We are the survivors of a cosmic lottery. We are a resilient thread in the tapestry of time, a species that stood at the edge of the abyss, looked down into the extinction that swallowed the titans, and chose, against all biological odds, to keep walking. Consider the evolutionary duality of this resilience. It is both a hardness and a softness. To survive the fire and the ice, we had to become hard. We had to develop the thrifty metabolism that hoarded energy. We had to develop the suspicious mind that watched the sky. We had to develop the calloused hands that could break the earth. But to keep the spark alive, we also had to remain soft. We had to protect the infant, the elder, the storyteller. We had to nurture the seed. We had to maintain the capacity for awe, for love, and for hope, even when the world offered us nothing but ash. This is the paradox of the human animal. We are the toughest creature to ever walk the earth, yet our survival depends entirely on our tenderness. The Great Reset was not the end, but a transformation. Nature, in her terrible wisdom, is a gardener who prunes with a heavy hand. The destruction of the Golden Age, the burning of the Emerald Wilderness, was a brutal pruning. It stripped away the easy abundance. It forced us out of the cradle. It demanded that we grow up. If the comet had missed the Earth, if it had passed by in the night as a harmless spectacle, we might still be wandering the Mammoth steppe, living in the eternal now, perfectly adapted to a world that never changed. We might never have stacked a stone. We might never have planted a grain of wheat. We might never have looked up at the stars and wondered what they were, only where they were. The trauma broke the world, yes, but it also broke open the human potential. It cracked the shell of our consciousness and forced us to invent the future. In the quiet of the night, as your breathing slows and your muscles unspool the tension of the day, the history of this struggle is written in the rhythm of your body. Place your hand in your mind over your heart. Feel that beat. It is a drum that has not stopped for 300,000 years. That rhythm is a direct line of continuity. It beat in the chest of the woman who ran from the fire. It beat in the chest of the man who shivered in the ice cave. It beat in the chest of the first farmer who watched the green shoot rise from the mud. If that drum had faltered, even once, in the long chain of generations, you would not be here. You are the recipient of an unbroken relay of life, a torch passed from hand to desperate hand through the storm. Your heart does not just pump blood, it pumps memory. It pumps the victory of survival. And consider the biography of the breath. Take a slow, deep inhale. Feel the cool air entering your nostrils, traveling down the throat, expanding the rib cage. This act, so simple, so automatic, is a communion with the past. The air you breathe is the same matter that swirled in the storms of the Younger Dryas. But more importantly, the ability to breathe it is a legacy. Your lungs are a masterpiece of adaptation. They are efficient enough to extract oxygen even at high altitudes, a trait refined during the migrations over mountain ranges. They are filtered to protect you from the dust, a memory of the ash-filled skies. Every breath is a confirmation that the atmosphere has healed. The smoke has cleared. The sun has returned. The air is sweet again. When you exhale, you are releasing the carbon that becomes the food for the plants, participating in the great healing cycle of the carbon that was once disrupted by the fire. As you lie there, Safe in the warmth of your modern cave, surrounded by the walls that your architectural ancestors taught you to build, remember that you are not alone. You are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses. The ghosts of the mammoth hunters, the spirits of the first farmers, the shadows of the temple builders, they are all standing watch. They are not scary ghosts. They are proud ancestors. They look at you, you with your full belly, your warm blanket, your safety, and they smile. You are the dream they dreamed in the dark. You are the future they fought for when they huddled around the dying embers of the Pleistocene fire. You are the proof that their suffering was not in vain. The eternal return is the realization that the story is not linear. It is a spiral. We face challenges, we are broken, we heal, and we grow, only to face new challenges. The visitor may have been a singular event, but the lesson it taught is eternal. Stability is an illusion, but resilience is real. We cannot control the sky. We cannot control the orbit of the comets or the pulse of the sun, but we can control how we respond. We can control the inner architecture of our spirits. We can choose, as our ancestors did, to be the architects of recovery rather than the victims of disaster. Think of the seed, the tiny hard kernel of potential that the first architect pressed into the mud. That seed is a metaphor for your own consciousness as you drift towards sleep. Sleep is a kind of winter. It is a time when we retreat into the dark, when we shut down the active systems, when we go underground. But it is not a death. It is a period of germination. In the dark of sleep, your body repairs itself. Your mind sorts through the memories of the day, storing what is useful and discarding what is not, just as the gatherers sorted the grain. You are preparing for the morning. You are preparing to rise again. The fear of the dark, which was born in the shadow of the comet, can now be laid to rest. The dark is no longer a threat. It is a blanket. The sentinels of the stars are watching over you, not as warnings, but as nightlights. The constellations, those lines drawn by the trembling hands of the first astronomers, are still there, fixed and steady. The Great Bear still walks the north. Orion still hunts the south. The order of the cosmos, once shattered, has held firm for 12 millennia. You can trust the night. Let the biography of the muscle release its hold. The tension in your shoulders, the readiness in your legs. Let it melt away. You do not need to run tonight. You do not need to hunt. You do not need to drag the stone pillars up the hill. The work is done. The harvest is gathered. The granary is full. The thrifty gene can stand down. Your body is a safe harbor. The ancient shiver of the comet's shadow is replaced by the warmth of the blood that flows freely and calmly through your veins. We are the children of the fire and the flood. This is our title and our nobility. We carry the fire in our minds, the spark of innovation, of storytelling, of hope. And we carry the flood in our blood, the fluidity, the adaptability, the ability to flow around obstacles and find a new path. The dreamers who emerged from the cave did not just build walls. They built meaning. They took the senseless violence of a cosmic impact and turned it into a story of redemption. They turned the blackened sun into a reason to worship the light. They turned the silence into a song. As you sink deeper into the mattress, imagine the soil beneath the building you are in. Go down past the concrete foundations, past the pipes and the wires. Go down into the earth, past the layers of the last century, past the medieval clay, past the Roman ruins. Go down to the black mat. See it there, a thin, dark line in the geology of the planet. It is quiet now. It is cold. It is finished. It is the foundation, but it is not the house. Above it, 12,000 years of life have accumulated. Layers of pollen, of bone, of pottery, of iron, of silicon. You are the flower blooming on the very top of that mountain of history. You are the result of the healing. The silence you hear now is not the silence of the acoustic void. It is the silence of peace. It is the silence of a world that is resting. The wind that blows outside is not the howling gale of the Younger Dryas. It is the gentle breath of the Holocene, the long summer that has cradled us for 10,000 years. It brings the smell of rain, of soil, of life continuing. Sleep now, knowing that you carry within you the strength of those who saw the sky fall. Think of that ancestor, the one we imagined standing on the ridge, watching the star become a sun. Imagine him turning away from the terror, turning back to his people, and lighting a fire. Imagine the woman planting the seed in the mud of the flood. They did not give up. They did not lie down and die. They chose life. And because they chose life, you are here. You are the living proof of their courage. Let the eternal return be a comforting thought. The sun will rise. The winter will end. The spring will come. The seed will sprout. The great reset is over. The great recovery is your birthright. You are safe. You are held. You are part of a story that does not end, but simply turns the page. Drift now, like a leaf on a slow river, carried by the current of time back to the ocean of sleep. The stars are watching, the earth is spinning, and the rhythm of your heart beats on, a steady, ancient drum in the quiet of the night.